The Thousand Year Blood War arc had introduced us to the overwhelming power of Yhwach's military unit, the Sternritter. These elite Quincy consist of 26 members, and they are granted a unique power known as a Schrift that is personally bestowed upon them by Yhwach himself. These Schrift abilities manifest in the form of letters, with each one representing a distinctive supernatural ability. From the fear, the explode, to the miracle, Kubo has crafted a wide range of abilities which perfectly reflect the personalities, psyches, and inner truths of each of the Sternritter members. Many of these Schrift powers transcend the limits of normal physical combat. Some Schrifts induce psychological trauma, some manipulate perception, and others twist the laws of reality itself. In today's video, I'm actually going to be breaking down all of the Schrift abilities of every single member of Yhwach's Quincy army, as I'll be diving deep into how these powers function, what they represent, and how they ultimately serve the grand goal of Yhwach. So without further delay, let's dive into every single Schrift ability that has been revealed thus far within Bleach. Before the video begins, only 20% of the people who actually watch my content are subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy these videos, then subscribe and stick around for more content just like this. Now let's get back to the topic of the video. In chapter 565, Kubo had given us an insight into the origins of Yhwach. He was depicted as an infant who could neither see, speak, hear, or move. However, this child had a remarkable ability. He could distribute fragments of his own soul to others. Now this is the root of the Schrift power system. Each Quincy Schrift represents a portion of Yhwach's power which is implanted into another Quincy. The Sternritter each have awakened and amplified a latent trait or ability that is unique to them. The moment that a Quincy drinks the blood of Yhwach, their soul becomes engraved with a lettered Schrift which unlocks their full potential. And upon their death, the power which Yhwach had given to them returns to him, thus further strengthening him. On Kubo's official fan site Klub Outside, in question 281 asked by a fan, they had wondered whether if the Schrifts are chosen based on the individual's personality or if Yhwach assigns them freely. Kubo explained that Yhwach can perceive words inscribed on people's very beings. He essentially reads their fate and he assigns the Schrift accordingly to them. If a Sternritter possessing a specific Schrift letter is lost during a battle, then this Schrift letter can be reawakened by being passed on to a new Quincy. It can be interpreted that Kubo had taken heavy inspiration from Judeo-Christian theology, especially when crafting Yhwach's character. The entire ritual of granting a Schrift to his followers mirrors religious rites like the Holy Communion, where partaking of blood or bread symbolizes divine unity. This elevates Yhwach just from a normal commander to a messianic figure. He is essentially a living god who is both the giver and collector of power amongst the Quincy. So now that we have a basic understanding of these Schrift powers, let's explore each of these Sternritter's terrifying abilities as we go through all of these Schrift letters from A to Z. In this video, I'm going to be deep diving into everything that we know about the Antithesis ability from the manga, as well as some anime exclusive scenes. It's mind-boggling to think about how rich with untapped potential Uryu's Schrift ability is. We didn't really know much about the Antithesis until the very end of the manga, which left us feeling like Uryu was severely underutilized in a story arc about his own race, and even though the Antithesis was revealed, it had nowhere near enough screen time to satisfy all of our expectations. From the very little that we see of the Antithesis, what makes this ability truly fascinating? The Antithesis is more than just a formidable power. It plays a massive role within the Thousand Year Blood War arc, and it carries forward the themes of duality and contrast that are rich within the Bleach story. The term Antithesis carries a lot of weight to it, with the Oxford Dictionary defining it as a person or a thing that is the direct opposite of someone or something else. It is also defined as a rhetorical device used within writing or speech, which serves as a proposition that contrasts or reverses a previously mentioned proposition. The antithesis can also be used to describe when two opposites are introduced together for contrasting effect. All of these definitions suggest one major thing: the existence of an antithesis is inherently reliant on a contrasting value. For there to be an antithesis, there needs to be a pre-existing idea. I'm sure you students of Kubology are already racking your minds as to what this pre-existing idea could be. Over the course of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, we become familiar with the concept of unique bonds that exist between certain Quincy. This idea becomes very relevant when discussing the antithesis. So hear me out while I talk specifically about the bond that exists between Yhwach and Yhwach. Hashward. Understanding this relationship is critical in order to grasp the essence of the Antithesis and its intended narrative significance. The bond between Yhwach and Hashward is more than just a emotional or a friendly tie. It resembles a cosmic connection that is akin to the relationship between the planets and the sun, or how the sun and the moon work in tandem in order to create specific phenomena on the Earth. It's as if this bond was orchestrated by the universe itself. I'm glad that the anime has already started to build up the mystery of this bond because it has profound and intriguing implications for understanding the Antithesis. Yhwach and Hashward are represented as two sides of the same scale. They exist solely in order to help the function of the other. From how Yhwach introduces himself to Hashward during their first meeting, it implies that Yhwach is fully aware of this role and has been searching for someone like Hashward for a very long time so that they can perform it. Quite notably, Yhwach even claims that Hashward completes him, as this further highlights the deep connection that they share. There's a frustrating level of mystery to this relationship due to how little is actually revealed about it, so I'm going to try my best to make as much sense of it as possible. So going even further ahead of the flashback in chapter 632, during Uryu's battle against Hashward in chapter 659, we learn that one side effect of the bond between Hashward and Yhwach is that their powers switch with each other when Yhwach is asleep. So whether if Yhwach is awake or not becomes a critical aspect of their bond. This idea is brought up within episode 18 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime, which expands upon the nature of Yhwach's power. In summary, Yhwach has shared countless pieces of his own soul with others, so he faces a massive challenge in managing this vast network of power. Even for a being of his caliber, this is a very demanding task which requires him to rest for a period of time, thus allowing him to rejuvenate his strength. Now, the sheer scale of this network that Yhwach has created is mind-boggling. This is where the need for another soul similar to Yhwach's incapacity and nature comes into play. Such a soul would temporarily shoulder the immense burden of power management, thus allowing Yhwach time to rejuvenate. It's noteworthy that Yhwach could only establish his formidable Quincy army, the Sternritter, after he had met with Hashward. This implies that Yhwach engraving letters onto the souls of his soldiers via these individual Schrifts is more of a profound and taxing use of his power than just simply sharing fragments of his soul with others. So without Hashward, Yhwach would struggle to maintain this network of Schrift abilities on his own. We can deduce that the Bleach universe had created Hashward as a means to support Yhwach's existence. Now you might be wondering why we needed to talk about Yhwach and Hashward before discussing Uryu's Antithesis ability. I like to answer that with a question. If the universe could create a perfect being who could support and facilitate Yhwach's power, what's stopping the Bleach universe from creating the very opposite of Yhwach, a being specifically designed to antagonize and counter Yhwach's power? Now this is where I believe Uryu Ishida and his Schrift ability, the Antithesis, enter the frame. Yhwach and Uryu are complete opposites on literally every single front. It's almost terrifying considering how literally everything Yhwach and Uryu do and experience within the story are the polar opposites of each other. In a Reddit thread by user Therevi, he goes over every single parallel between these two characters, and I highly recommend that you check this post out. It's evident that Kubo had crafted the story in such a way that Uryu's very being and even the experiences that he has had in his life had resulted in him being the antithesis of Yhwach, thus resulting in a deep multi-layered narrative, because as we journey through the 1000-Year Blood War arc, it is heavily implied time and time again that there was something special about Uryu's character. Unfortunately, Kubo wasn't able to convey the true meaning of the Antithesis and what it could actually do because of Bleach's rushed and abrupt ending. Despite this, Kubo left several hints in the story which ultimately help us to paint a picture as to the direction that he was heading towards. Let's turn our attention towards how Uryu acquires the Antithesis ability. To unlock this power, Uryu had to take part in the ritual of drinking Yhwach's blood in order to acquire his own Schrift ability. It's interesting to note that this ritual isn't about bestowing new abilities, but it's more about awakening the dormant powers that already reside within the individual. Yhwach's blood acts as a catalyst, suggesting that the power that Uryu awakens was always a deep-rooted aspect of his own soul, thus clarifying that the Antithesis wasn't just a power that was assigned to Uryu. Yhwach's choice of the letter A to represent Uryu's power appears to align perfectly with Uryu's inherent nature. It implies that while the specific letter is Yhwach's choice, the actual power resonates uniquely with the individual who receives it. it. Hence why the Antithesis could have manifested under various different labels like C for counter, or O for observe, or R for reverse, but the essence of the power would still remain unchanged. Yhwach adds that Uryu possesses a power that could even supersede his own. The true extent of the Antithesis remains a mystery until the final chapters of the manga. This is in chapter 679 during Uryu's battle against Hashwald. The battle unfolds with Uryu severely injured, and it's unclear whether if this is as a result of Hashwald's overwhelming strength or if it's a strategic move by Uryu. It's evident that Hashwald is holding back during this battle because he appears to be more focused on preventing Uryu from joining Ichigo in his battle against Yhwach. Now, we are introduced to this fight with Uryu appearing to be heavily injured, because most of this battle, you guessed it, appears off screen. Uryu reveals the power of his Schrift as the Antithesis allows him to reverse and exchange the outcome of events between two specific points. Utilizing this ability, Uryu transfers all of his injuries to Hashwald, simultaneously healing himself as well as inflicting damage onto his opponent. This moment, brief as it is, highlights the immense potential of the Antithesis. Hashwald quickly recognizes that Uryu's power could be the one force that is capable of challenging Yhwach's the Almighty. We've established that the Antithesis allows Uryu to reverse events that have occurred between two chosen points. In order to fully grasp what this entails, let's compare it to a similar ability within Bleach, which is the Almighty. Yhwach's Schrift ability is also a form of causality manipulation. Yhwach wielding the Almighty demonstrates the power to nullify future attacks before they even occur within the present. This draws a parallel with Uryu's Antithesis, which operates on a similar principle but works retrospectively. It enables Uryu to undo the consequences of actions and attacks after they have taken place. For instance, if Uryu is harmed, then he can reverse the roles by transferring the injuries that he sustains to his opponent. Additionally, Yhwach's ability to bypass defenses, ensuring his attacks always land, is also able to be countered by Uryu's Antithesis. Uryu could theoretically use his power to reverse his opponent's defense into an offense, therefore guaranteeing that Uryu's attacks are 100% successful. In essence, the Antithesis is a strategic reversal of roles that can occur at any point in the heat of battle. The Almighty also showcases the ability to disintegrate objects before their creation. This is seen when Yhwach destroys Ichigo's true Bankai. Following this logic, Uryu's Antithesis could potentially reverse the destruction of an object by swapping out its damaged state with an intact one. This aspect of the Antithesis hints at the possibility of Uryu being able to restore Ichigo's true Bankai. In simple terms, reversing a broken state with something that is whole. We can probably imagine more basic ways that Uryu can use the Antithesis, like for example switching positions with someone else, in a manner that is similar to Sasuke's Heavenly Hand power, which allows him to do something similar. Uryu can also use the Antithesis to switch the positions of objects with each other, which would be a really cool way of disarming opponents and thus taking away any important possessions that are in the hands of an enemy. This is actually something that we see take place within the anime when Uryu uses the Antithesis to free Yhwach from Kiryo's cage of life. So I'm really glad that the anime has started to give us more ways that this unique Schrift ability can be utilized. And this one example is in line with some of the stuff that we're theorizing about the Antithesis. Now, there is another dimension of the Antithesis that we haven't delved into just yet, and it involves the conceptual way that this ability can be used. Imagine how ridiculous it would be if Uryu could just switch his physical strength with that of his opponent, or another stat like speed, or even switch powers with an enemy. What if things get really ridiculous with Uryu being able to reverse the existence of an enemy with something else, effectively erasing them from reality? The possibilities are endless when it comes to the Antithesis, and if Kubo and the anime team plan on expanding upon this power in the upcoming course of the anime, then they've really got their work cut out for them. So this brings me to the final point of the video, which is the glaring weakness of the Antithesis. The reality is that overwhelming Uryu with a sufficiently powerful attack before he can even activate the Antithesis is a very effective strategy to use against him. This weakness actually balances the insane potential of the Antithesis, but then again, Uryu has abilities like Ranso Tengai, which allows him to force his body to move even in situations where he is physically paralyzed. This of course doesn't mean anything if Uryu's head gets blown off immediately. Would Ranso Tengai allow him to activate the Antithesis even in such an extreme circumstance? The common theme is that there are several elements with this power that are still left up in the air, which leaves us eagerly anticipating what additions Kubo is going to make with the Antithesis for Core 3 and 4 of the anime. The Antithesis is an ability that was made specifically with the Almighty in mind, which suggests that it was purposefully created in order to serve as the perfect counter to the Almighty. Quite notably, Uryu and Hashward are the highest ranking Quincy within Yhwach's army, with Hashward effectively being Yhwach's right-hand man and Uryu being Yhwach's successor. With these high positions within his army, it reflects the contrasting elements of Yhwach's power. While Hashward's power complements Yhwach's, Uryu's Schrift ability on the other hand can potentially destroy him. This dynamic forms a compelling power triangle. The Antithesis is the perfect counter to the Almighty, but at the same time it is weak against Hashward's The Balance, which in turn is powerless against the Almighty's sheer force. This intricate interplay of strengths and vulnerabilities not only deepens the characters' relationships, but it also perfectly complements the narrative, and I'm hoping that the anime adaptation is going to be delving into these aspects in order to give fans a deeper understanding of Uryu's power, which unfortunately wasn't present within the manga. So what are your thoughts about the Antithesis? How do you think this Schrift ability should be used during the final portions of the 1000-Year Blood War arc? And what do you think about the prospect of Uryu retaining his Schrift abilities post the 1000-Year Blood War arc? How would a power like the Antithesis be used in the Bleach Hell arc? Imagine the perfect power that is dubbed as the all-knowing and all-powerful. I am of course describing Yhwach's ability, the Almighty. Fans have also described this ability to be the most broken power within all of Bleach. For a long time I've wanted to break down and analyze Yhwach's signature ability, which has saved his life multiple times. Admittedly, it had started to become frustrating to see him repeatedly come up with the perfect counter to any opponent. After all, it was the Almighty which had saved him from being defeated by Ichibei and Ichigo. This ability was pretty confusing because there is such a lack of understanding when it comes to this power, so it's pretty easy to assume that the ability is an arsepull every time that it was used. And it's for this reason, in this video, I will explain how the Almighty works, speaking about its strengths and any weaknesses that it may have. And hopefully by the end of this video, I will go over some exclusive information about the Almighty that we learn about within the Can't Fear Your Own World light novels. If Yhwach had such an incredible ability, then how was it that he was defeated by Head Captain Yamamoto over 1,000 years ago? We can assume that he did not have the powers of the Almighty during the first war between the Quincy and the Shinigami, or he may have had a very unrefined version of this power. We know that he had split his soul into several pieces in order to power the Sternritter. This had drained his power, and it may have been the reason as to why he was unable to use the Almighty against Yamamoto back then. After he returns from being sealed, it seems like Yhwach has so much more power now that he could defeat anyone with this Almighty ability. Literally, the very second that he becomes bored with the enemy, he decides to defeat them with this power. This was the case when he was battling against Ichibei. The very second that he had gotten bored and no longer wanted to entertain him, he literally had blown him up thanks to the Almighty. Yhwach was sealed for over 1,000 years, and it had taken 900 years for his heart to be restored, 90 years for him to regain his intellect, 9 years to regain his power, and additionally we learn in chapter 610 that if he were to have opened his eyes, meaning used the Almighty, before the final 9 years were up, then he may have lost the ability to control the maximum potential of his power. By taking this risk, he would have lost control and taken back all of the power from his most loyal subordinates. It is only once his power is properly restored that Yhwach finally regains his full strength. Upon activating the ability, he gains 2 irises and pupils in both of his eyes. We learn that the Almighty ability is shared between Yhwach and his right-hand man Hashward. During the day, it is held by Yhwach, and during the night, Hashward controls it while he is asleep. In chapter 614, after activating the Almighty in front of Ichigo and the others, he states that his eyes appear different because they now see everything, and they are the proof of a true Quincy. He tells Ichigo that he is aware that they had met Ichibei before coming to confront him. He knows that they had helped resurrect him and that Ichibei had talked them into coming here. He reveals he has foreseen everything that is about to happen, as he knows that Ichigo would show up to challenge him and that it would be too late for him to prevent the death of the Soul King. He had prior knowledge of all of this thanks to the Almighty. So how does this broken ability work? How is it that Yhwach is able to see into the future and be able to know about the outcome of events prior to them unfolding? The Almighty allows Yhwach to see into the future, but this is not a linear future. He in fact can see multiple different futures that have occurred through different outcomes in the present. After he is able to see his desired future, he chooses that timeline and brings it to the present. He had done exactly this to counter Ichigo's new Bankai, which he had admitted was far too formidable
and had to be taken care of immediately. By using the Almighty, he had selected a timeline where he had broken his new Bankai, and he brought this to the present, thus explaining why Ichigo's Bankai immediately broke after activation. In chapter 677, he describes being able to see the future with the analogy of each future being like a grain of sand that is swept away by the wind. Each grain represents an isolated future, in other words, a possible outcome. He is able to watch over all of the grains of sand from a higher plane, and using this knowledge, he is able to perfectly counter his opponents and already be aware of any actions that they may take against him. This is just one aspect of the Almighty. Yhwach reveals in chapter 678 that the true power of the Almighty is to alter the future into any outcome that he desires. He demonstrates this power by setting up traps against Ichigo and proving to him that he is aware of his every move thanks to his power. He is even able to attack his opponents before they realize that they have been hit. He is also able to bypass Orihime's shields, allowing him to strike Ichigo, demonstrating that he can overcome any defensive abilities or counterattacks. In chapter 684, he uses the Almighty to rewrite the future in which he dies, allowing him to effectively prevent his own death. Only Yhwach is able to use this aspect of the Almighty, as Hashwad explains in chapter 675 that he is only borrowing the powers and thus is unable to use the full extent of them. The Almighty allows Yhwach to give power to others, as well as being able to take them away too. He bestows power onto others by sharing a piece of his soul with them. This results in enhancing the life of that individual. In the same vein, he can also steal these powers back from others by having the pieces of his soul returned to him. Now this happens automatically when those that he shares his soul with die, or he can take the powers back by force using his ability Ashwalan. When he sees into the future, he is able to understand what happens in those futures, as long as his vision is not impaired. He can change the future by moving from one possible future to another. Yhwach describes the Almighty as being able to rewrite the future, and we are able to understand that he does so by altering an event within the present which will directly result in his desired future. People get confused by this because Yhwach is not actually changing the future in the conventional way that we know of, which is by changing the present directly. He is in fact affecting the present by altering the future. He is jumping to another future that has his desired outcome, which explains how he is able to negate almost any power that is used against him. Adding to this, Yhwach is able to understand how an ability works. He is then able to negate the effects of it, meaning that it can no longer harm him. The aspect of the Almighty that allows him to see into every possible future is reliant upon his eyesight. However, this power appears to not work on the Soul King and his body parts, as well as Uryu, because he has the ability called the Antithesis. So if a power exists that can affect Yhwach's eyesight, then this will prevent him from being able to see into the future, thus explaining why Aizen's Kyokasuigatsu was so effective against the Almighty. Speaking of ways to overcome the Almighty, let's now turn our attention towards the weaknesses of this broken ability. One of the most glaring weaknesses of the Almighty is when it swaps between Yhwach and Hashwad. It becomes weaker when it is wielded by Hashwad, as he is unable to change the future with it. Basbi had also stated in chapter 630 that by killing Hashwad when he is in possession of the Almighty, it will destroy the ability. Another weakness of the Almighty is that the Soul King and his body parts like Mimihagi are unable to be affected by it, which explains why he did not foresee Mimihagi appearing to restore the Soul King. And like I just mentioned, anything that affects the perception of Yhwach will affect the power of the Almighty, because this power is reliant upon Yhwach's 5 senses being intact. When Kyokasuigetsu is used against him, it affects the Almighty, and it prevents him from being able to predict that Ichigo would have striked him from behind, delivering a fatal blow. This would have been enough to end their battle if Yhwach didn't change the future in which he dies. Yuha's power is also affected by any power that has the ability to alter the past. After he changes the future to break Ichigo's new Bankai, it ends up being restored by Tsukishima, who has the power to change the past. Additionally, Uryu's ability, the Antithesis, is able to also overcome the Almighty, as it appears to work by being able to swap events that have already occurred between 2 targets. The biggest weakness of the Almighty is the Silver of Stillness, which forms like a blood clot within the heart of any victim of Ashwalan. If this silver makes contact with the blood of the caster of Ashwalan, then it will temporarily disable its power, giving anyone a perfect opportunity to defeat Yhwach while his powers are nullified, thus stopping him from altering the future in which he dies. Now, within the Can't Fear Your Own World light novels, we learned that the Almighty was in fact a key ability of the Soul King. This power ended up being inherited by Yhwach. Similar to Yhwach, this power had allowed the Soul King to be all-knowing and all-powerful. It was because of this power that the Soul King was aware of the future. We also learned that Ichibe and Yhwach had assumed that the Soul King was aware of his own death millions of years before it had happened. The version of the Almighty that that the Soul King had possessed was powerful enough to allow the ancestors of the 5 great noble families to split the singular world into 3 separate realms of Hueco Mundo, the human world, and the Soul Society. It literally was responsible for creating the cycle of life and death. After being imprisoned as the linchpin of reality, it was the power of the Almighty which regulated the souls that flow between the separate worlds. Without the Soul King or the Almighty, the balance of souls would be lost and the worlds would merge into one. Lastly, when the Almighty is activated, it makes a maximum of 3 pupils per eye when it is used by Yhwach, but we see that it makes 4 pupils appear within the eyes of the Soul King. This leads me and others to believe that the Soul King was in possession of a superior version of the Almighty.
Ugram Hashward is in fact one of the first characters that we meet within the 1000-Year Blood War arc. He first appears within chapter 485 of the manga and in episode 2 of the all-new Bleach anime. He was gifted with the letter B as his shrift, which stands for the balance. This was a very intentional choice on Kubo's part, since Hashward is Yhwach's second in command, as it makes perfect sense for the letter A, which is the shrift that Yhwach possesses, to be followed by the letter B. Interestingly enough, Hashward's power is also second to Yhwach's in a very different way, because it's very likely the second most overpowered Quincy ability. Now, you may be thinking that there are other shrifts that might be more deserving of this title, like Grammy's the Visionary or Gerard's the Miracle, but unlike the balance, these are pretty simple abilities whose implications are clear enough to fully understand. The balance, on the other hand, is a very complex ability with unknown limits that are yet to be explored, and it's in this unexplored potential that I believe the true power of the balance lies. In this video, I want to go over everything that there is to know about Hashward's shrift, the balance. The balance is a shrift that appears on 2 separate brief occasions within the story. You would think that a Sternritter who appears so much within the 1000-Year Blood War arc would have more opportunity to show off his signature ability. On the other hand, the brief display of his power may just be a testament to just how powerful he is without having to resort to using the balance. Despite this, I do wish that we got to see more of the balance, but instead of fretting over what we didn't get to see, let's focus on everything that was revealed about Hashward's power. The first time that we see him utilize this ability is within chapter 559, and it's not too far into the second invasion of the Quincy. It's after Kangdu and BG9 had been defeated by Hitsugaya and Soifon. Now, both of the defeated Sternritter were tied up and were about to be executed by Hashward under the orders of Yhwach. He states that lives saved by good fortune must be taken by a directly proportionate amount of misfortune. He punctuates this statement with a sword slash aimed at Kangdu, intending to kill him. Now, this slash is however blocked by Kangdu, who uses his iron shrift to harden his skin to prevent the blade from doing any damage to him. Kangdu states that the only person he'd allow to kill him is Yhwach himself. It's quite ironic that Kangdu asks Hashward if he had forgotten what his ability was. This question in fact really applies to Kangdu, because it's at that moment that he was ignorant of Hashward's power which had sealed his fate. He muses to himself that a second show of fortune had appeared, a fact that he makes known to Kangdu. Now, this is followed by a really cool panel where we see an oversized scale behind Hashward as he asks Kangdu if he can see that the scale is tipping. The Sternritter realizes a second too late as Hashward's blade descends, slicing him clean in half and killing him. And for some reason, he has absolutely no difficulty in cutting Kangdu, who should in fact have his iron skin ability. Now, this did confuse me when I'd read this when it was first released, but thankfully we get a bit more context the next time that we see Hashward utilize the balance. The next time that we see his power is within chapter 679, during Hashward's battle against Uryu. Now, this is after Uryu fails to kill him over the course of the night. After Hashward swaps with Yhwach and loses the Almighty, he regains his shrift, the balance, during the daybreak. He then explains exactly what the balance is to Uryu, who at the time couldn't look worse for wear. He explains that his shrift, the balance, allows him to redirect misfortune that has occurred within his sphere of influence. Hashward explains that by allocating misfortune to those who were fortunate, he was able to maintain balance within the world, adding that all misfortune that befalls him is transferred to his sacrificial shield, and that an equal amount of said misfortune is reflected back to his opponent. This makes Hashward immune to his own ability of redirecting fortune and misfortune, despite the fact that he believes that everyone else should be judged by his ability. Now, this is a detail that I'll dive deeper into during my Hashward character analysis video, which you can expect in the not too distant future. But to further emphasize just how disconnected Hashward is from this universal law that he claims to represent, the balance also allows him to transform the fortune that has resulted in his misfortune into misfortune for his enemy. To break this confusing situation down, if you're fortunate enough to hurt Hashward, then the damage ends up being transferred into his sacrificial shield. He then transforms the fortune that had allowed you to hurt him into misfortune. This is demonstrated when he reverses all of the injuries that he has sustained via Uryu's use of his ability, the Antithesis. Now, this is everything that we actually get to see of the balance within the Bleach manga. You might be wondering why I've been hyping up the power of the balance so much, but to explain that, we need to understand what the balance deems as misfortune and fortune, because understanding this reveals the real deadliness of its power. When he had used the balance against Kangdu, Hashward had first tried to kill him with his raw physical strength, which had resulted in his slash being blocked by Kangdu. Now it appears that he wasn't using the balance at the time of the attack, so it means that the balance records all instances of fortune and misfortune even outside of its activation. This is also proven when Hashward counts the blocking of his attack as a second show of fortune. Kangdu's first instance of fortune was surviving his battle against Hitsugaya. So breaking it down even further, a misfortune had befallen Hashward because his attack was blocked by Kangdu, and inversely Kangdu was fortunate in blocking his attack. When Hashward activates the balance, he uses it to rectify this imbalance. It converts all the fortune that had allowed Kangdu to block Hashward's attack, and then it converts it into misfortune. Now doing this allows him to now effortlessly bypass Kangdu's defenses in order to kill him. In conclusion, the balance had defined Hashward's inability to hurt Kangdu as a misfortune, while defining Kangdu's blocking of Hashward's attack as a fortune. Moving on to Hashward's battle against Uryu, the fight itself opens up with Hashward explaining exactly what his Schrift does to a severely injured Uryu. Now this implies that Hashward had already used his powers to reverse any harm Uryu had done to him. This is eventually confirmed after he is wounded by the Antithesis, but the wounds end up being reflected onto Uryu's body. He gives back Uryu's misfortune that was inflicted onto him, since the Antithesis had caused his wounds to instantly appear on his body, but the balance had reflected this misfortune back in the same manner. Now this detail becomes much more important later on, and it's here where I'd started to notice a pattern. In all of Hashward's uses of the balance, there's a common denominator. There is, pun intended, no balance in his power. It's an ability that gives all the misfortune to his opponents, and it saves all the fortune for himself. It's a power that doesn't make Hashward better, it just makes his opponents significantly worse. This detail is a key aspect of Hashward's character, which I'll dive deeper into in my character analysis of him. So after breaking it all down, we come to the conclusion that the balance really only serves one purpose, which is bending the laws of cause and effect in Hashward's favor and his alone. If Hashward is unable to harm his opponents, the balance lowers their physical durability, or it increases Hashward's power so that he can essentially bypass any restrictions placed on landing an attack. And in terms of defense, if Hashward ends up being harmed, the balance allows him to transfer that exact amount of damage in the same manner that it was delivered to his opponent, along with some extra damage too. We need to now define what falls under the category of misfortune. From all of Hashward's fights, we can confirm that things like his opponents being able to breathe or walk can't be turned against them as misfortune. This is because the balance only affects things that directly affect Hashward. Kangdu being alive or being able to talk was not fortunate enough to guarantee his being killed by Hashward. He first needed to cause Hashward some direct misfortune, and this was done by blocking his attack, which had resulted in the balance allowing Hashward to gain the power to ignore his defenses. And something similar had happened with his battle against Uryu and when the wounds were reversed. So this means that if Hashward were to battle against somebody he was too slow to hit, his inability to hit his opponent would have been deemed as a misfortune, and by virtue of that he would have been able to make his opponent slower by reversing their fortune. In this analogy, it would balance out the difference in speed, and it would make him significantly faster now that his opponent has gotten slower. So misfortune in this context can be defined as whatever hurts Hashward or prevents him from attacking his opponent. Thanks to the balance, Hashward is never disadvantaged. This ability literally balances out the playing field and gives him an unprecedented advantage over his opponents in any given situation. So after explaining just how powerful the balance is, I think you can appreciate why this is one of the most powerful
Schrifts amongst the Quincy, standing toe-to-toe with abilities like the Visionary, the Miracle, the Deathdealing, and the X-Axis. If we're to compare the balance with the Deathdealing, it's probably the easiest win for the balance. If Askin withstands enough of Hashward's attacks, he'd have gained an immunity to his Reiatsu, and incidentally becoming invulnerable to any offensive ability that Hashward possesses. Now this immediately becomes a misfortune that the balance needs to rectify, since Hashward would have then become unable to hurt Askin. This would result in the balance applying an equal amount of misfortune onto Askin. This means that Hashward would have been able to attack Askin with enough opposing force to nullify his immunity. So by taking away Askin's immunity, Hashward would then have been able to kill him quite easily. If Askin were to have used any of his gift balls or had tried to lower Hashward's resistance to anything, then something similar would also happen. The balance would simply transfer the misfortune to his sacrificial shield and reflect the same lowered resistance to Askin, plus an additional lowering due to the transfer, making him even weaker than he had made Hashward. This once again results in Hashward gaining a massive advantage over Askin and guaranteeing his victory. Now moving on in order of difficulty, let's see how the balance would fare against Lil Barrow's the X-Axis. Defensively speaking, the X-Axis grants Lil Barrow with complete intangibility, which is a massive disadvantage to anyone that he faces off against, because it means that Lil can no longer be harmed. But thankfully this wouldn't be a problem for Hashward. This guarantees that the balance would immediately alter Lil Barrow's fortune from his intangibility into equivalent misfortune. He would become tangible again so that Hashward would have no problem being able to hit him. Because of Lil's other powers, it does make you wonder if negating his intangibility will be enough to guarantee his defeat. Well, this is a question that will be answered in our upcoming Sternritter Versus series, where we'll compare multiple different Sternritter amongst themselves and other characters to see who's more powerful and who would most likely win in a battle. So definitely look forward to that video series dropping soon. Now moving on, this is where things start to get very interesting, but unfortunately not enough to change the dominance of the balance. I do intend to analyze the Visionary in its own separate video, as well as going over its limitations and powers, so I'm only going over the key abilities of the Visionary in this comparison. The Visionary grants Gremmy the ability to manifest his imagination into reality, but if Hashward were to go against this ability, whatever attack Gremmy would imagine against him would simply be reflected back onto Gremmy in equal proportions and then some, and whatever way Gremmy would try to enhance his durability would be reversed in order to make him even weaker. Because of the broken nature of the balance, things would play out very similarly to how they did with the other two Schrifts that we have talked about. Now the last Schrift that I'm comparing the balance to is the Miracle, and it's easily the most absurd matchup of them all. The Miracle is easily the most annoying power-up within the entire story of Bleach. It allows its user Gerard to do practically anything, as long as manifesting that outcome could be considered miraculous. And in all honesty, this power is just as ridiculous as it sounds. Typically, it manifests through the conversion of any damage that he takes into an equivalent increase in strength and size. This makes him essentially unkillable and also the most physically powerful character within Bleach. With all of this in mind, let's find out how such an ability would hold up against Hashward's the Balance. If Hashward were to clash against Gerard, it would result in the Miracle enhancing Gerard's physical power because of any wounds that he sustains from his opponent. This action would then be recognized as a misfortune by the Balance, resulting in it dishing out an equivalent amount of misfortune to Gerard in order to remove its power up. But it wouldn't stop there. The Miracle would then restore Gerard's power, because why not? Because after all, it would fit into the definition of a miracle if it could. The Balance would once again correct this by weakening Gerard even more, and this would result in somewhat of a back and forth, even worse than what we had when Hashward had fought against Uryu, because unlike that fight, this exchange would continue into infinity, resulting in a stalemate. Now this would mean that the Balance is the only power outside of the Almighty that is able to stalemate the Miracle. In this comparison, I haven't decided who would win in this hypothetical battle. It's just to explain how these two powers would interact. But let me know in the comments if you actually want a full what-if breakdown of Hashward versus Gerard. I would love to go over that fight and to talk about different battle statistics and ultimately who would come out on top. I hope by comparing the Balance to these different Schrifts, you're now able to understand just how much of an insane power it is. In a reality where an ability like the Almighty exists, Yhwach's underling and his second in command needed a power that was worthy of the title that he holds. The Balance is one of my favorite abilities utilized within the 1000-Year Blood War arc, and I do hope that we get to see more of it within the anime, especially during Hashward's battle against
against Uryu. Pernida is one of the select few Sternritter who has made it into Yhwach's elite guard, the Schutzstaffel. Over the course of the story, Pernida is revealed to be the left hand of the Soul King, as it governs over progress. When it was first revealed, Pernida had no real personality as it didn't really speak, but over the course of its battle against Mayuri, it had slowly started to mumble and form speech. Pernida is quickly revealed to be very arrogant and overconfident, as it mocks Mayuri by imitating his laugh after having defeated his modified Bankai. Pernida takes a lot of pride in its identity as a Quincy, and it is visibly irritated when this is questioned. At the beginning of episode 24, when we have that flashback from 1,000 years ago, we had seen Ichibei bring Pernida with him to the human world, back when he had attempted to form a truce with Yhwach in his Empire of Light. When Yhwach had refused Ichibei's offer for a truce, he had activated the Almighty, but at that moment Ichibei had summoned Pernida, as it had then possessed the body of Yhwach and had prevented him from using the Almighty. Sometime following this, Pernida had split from Yhwach and had identified itself as a Quincy, as it was enlisted into Yhwach's Sternritter, being a part of Yhwach's very own Schutzstaffel. Similar to Gerard Valkyrie, Pernida wasn't really bestowed a Schrift by Yhwach. This is because both Pernida and Gerard are body parts of the Soul King, so they had inherently possessed special abilities from birth. Because of this, Yhwach had ascribed a letter to their abilities. Pernida was given the letter C for the Compulsory. In this video, I want to break down and analyze everything that we know about Pernida's Schrift ability. I'll be talking about every time that it was utilized within the story, and how the Compulsory was such a formidable Schrift ability that it had posed a significant challenge even to Shinigami like Senjumaru, Yoruichi, and even Kenpachi. Pernida uses the Compulsory for the very first time within chapter 599. This is following Senjumaru having summoned a massive guard in order to battle against the Schutzstaffel. The Compulsory was used to compress and contort this gigantic guard, and Pernida uses the Schrift again in chapter 600 in order to clean up the mess that Lil Barrow had made after shooting Senjumaru through the head. By using the Compulsory, it was able to compress the body of Senjumaru into a ball so that it would not be in the way of Yhwach. These first two very brief displays of its Schrift ability highlight just how deadly of a power it is. Because Pernida governs over progress, it has control over the concept of evolution. Pernida is able to constantly evolve and enhance itself, both physically as well as psychologically. Due to its advanced evolution, it is able to adapt while in battle in order to survive. This adaptive evolutionary power is as a result of being able to learn from anything that Pernida's nerves make contact with. When making contact with the body of Kenpachi Zaraki, it had evolved itself to the power level of Kenpachi, and it had also copied the layer shedding ability of Mayuri's modified Bankai. In chapter 643, we see Pernida also have the power to evolve by absorbing and consuming the biological mass of others. By doing so, the Quincy gains the abilities of that said individual. This further highlights just how terrifying Pernida's base abilities are without even taking into consideration the Compulsory. Pernida can also manipulate its body by removing the fingers or growing additional parts on itself, and one of the key powers that Pernida possesses is the ability to copy itself. When one of Pernida's fingers is removed from its body, then it's able to create a copy of itself from that severed finger. Pernida's opponents can distinguish a clone from the real Pernida by the fact that a copy only has a single pupil in its eye, and it doesn't have the Hagal rune on its wrist. These clones of Pernida also have the power to utilize the Compulsory. In chapter 643, we had seen that these clones can also reshape and reform even after taking a great deal of damage. Thanks to its cloning ability, Pernida also has the power to regenerate, as it can regrow any body parts that it loses, including its fingers. It appears as though there are no limits to its regenerative abilities, as even when its body was destroyed in chapter 643, Pernida was able to completely reform itself in a very short amount of time. Pernida's Volstandig was not revealed within the manga, but in the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime, during episode 25, we did in fact get to see its holy form, as it sprouts these golden colored wings which are shaped in the form of hands, along with this star-shaped halo above its head. During Pernida's anime exclusive battle against Kiryu Hikifune, It had used its wings in order to grab and attack its opponent, and it was also able to fly through the air at high speeds with its wings. So now that we know the basic abilities of Pernida, it's time to talk about its Schrift ability, the Compulsory. Essentially, the Compulsory involves Pernida firing off nerves from its fingers, as these then extend into the body of its opponent, thus allowing Pernida to forcibly control his target's body part. In chapter 636, we see Pernida's nerves enter the right arm of Kinpachi, as his broken arm begins to continuously twist on its own. Kinpachi, knowing that Pernida would only continue to control more of his body, is forced to rip off his own arm. Upon removing his arm, it continues to twist and contort until it becomes a puddle of blood. Mayuri even convinced Kinpachi that it was a wise decision to rip off his arm, because his entire body would have been twisted and contorted into a meatball. In chapter 643, after firing several nerves into the body of Nemu, Pernida was able to instantly detonate her body, reducing her to nothing. In chapter 619, Pernida had appeared behind Yoruichi and had instantly contorted her left arm, as she was shocked by the power that was just used against her. In chapter 635, we see it break Kinpachi's right arm, and then in the following chapter, it breaks both of Kinpachi's legs. In chapter 638, Mayuri observes that Pernida is able to run its nerves through inorganic matter. As the nerves spread through the ground, as Pernida shapes and controls the surface into a gigantic hand which towers over Mayuri. It can also fire its nerves alongside the walls of buildings in order to create giant arms, which it uses to attack its opponents with. In chapter 638, we see Pernida utilize the Compulsory from one of its severed fingers. Now, it seems like the condition for the Compulsory to work in a severed body part is for an eye to appear on that body part, thus allowing Pernida to remotely use the Compulsory. In chapter 656, Askin reveals that both Pernida and Gerard are the only Quincy's which Yhwach did not grant powers to, as they were already born with very unique abilities, thus confirming that Pernida, the left hand of the Soul King, was born with the Compulsory. Now, there are a few limitations when it comes to Pernida's Schrift ability. In chapter 636, Mayuri quickly deduces that Pernida's powers can be countered by taking advantage of its exposed nerves. Mayuri releases acid which makes contact with several nerves which are fired towards him. Pernida reacts in pain, as seen through its eye expression changing as it immediately retracts its nerves, with Mayuri stating that it possesses a very intriguing power, as he's going to enjoy testing several drugs on its nervous system. Pernida totally loses its composure as it breaks out from its hooded cloak, thanks to Mayuri taking advantage of this single weakness. In chapter 638, when its nerves enter the right arm of Mayuri, he immediately reconfigures the arrangement of his nerves, blood vessels, and muscles, thus rendering Pernida unable to control his arm. So if a structure of a body part which is invaded by Pernida's nerves is altered, it can no longer be controlled by the Quincy. In chapter 643, when Mayuri takes back the brain of Nemu from Pernida, he demonstrates that he is able to repel the nerves of Pernida by releasing a wave of concentrated spiritual pressure. Pernida is not only one of the most unique Quincy within Yhwach's army, it's also the most distinctive character in the series. When it isn't using its Schrift ability, Pernida is also able to summon a bow and arrow, as the bow is formed between its index and ring finger, as it fires off arrows from the bow using its thumb. In chapter 640, it's also revealed that it can create smaller bows on the tips of its fingers in order to fire several arrows at once. In chapter 640, we see that Pernida's arrows have nerves which are attached to them, as it can also use its nerves to spread across the ground and grab any arrows which miss its target, like this arrow which was bent around and fired towards Mayuri's back, as Nemu was forced to intervene to protect her captain. This idea of death taking on many forms becomes very real when you realize that there are a lot of fatal consequences to consuming several different substances in certain amounts. In fact, every substance in existence, even something as essential as oxygen, has a lethal dose. Understandably, excessive amounts of any substance can be harmful. For example, 10 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight is considered considered to be toxic. In other circumstances, a lack of a substance can be just as deadly. If an average-sized individual were to lose 2 liters of blood, then they would die from blood loss. All of these examples are an eternal reminder that our lives are held together by a very fragile balance, and we should definitely live our lives with this fact in mind. The Sternritter Askin Naklavar's Schrift ability, the Deathdealing, takes this fragile balance and flips it upside down. His Schrift ability is easily among my favourites to have been introduced during the 1000-Year Blood War arc. It's a perfect blend of scientific knowledge and power. As fascinating as this ability is, it functions very mysteriously, and it's for this reason that I hope that you stick around until the very end of this video, as I'll be explaining everything that there is to know about Askin's Schrift ability, the Deathdealing. There is a lot to unpack here as we are discussing the powers of one of the Schutzstaffel members. Personally, I never got the feeling that Askin was going to be one of those characters who was going to stick around for a very long time. From his very first appearance within the story, he appeared to be a character whose main draw was his charisma and his fun personality. I assumed that he would have a decently powerful Schrift, but nothing that the majority of the Shinigami wouldn't be able to deal with. Askin's role within the story exceeded my expectations when it was revealed that he is in fact an incredibly strong Quincy. He wasn't just simply another fun and fascinating villain within the story, he had proved himself to be a force to be reckoned with. His Schrift ability, the Deathdealing, bestows upon him such immense power that Yhwach had decided to include him within his elite group, the Schutzstaffel. And despite him now being surrounded by absolute godlike individuals, he still manages to stand out amongst the other Schutzstaffel members. While his peers like Lil Barrow possess overpowered broken abilities like the X-axis, I believe that the Deathdealing is more of a balanced power in comparison. So we first see this ability revealed within chapter 602 of the manga. This occurs during the fall of Squad Zero, which will always be etched into my memory as one of the greatest Hero to Zero moments within all of fiction. Thankfully, the battle between the Zero Division and the Schutzstaffel has been improved upon heavily within the anime, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what other changes and additions will be made to this battle at the beginning of the 3rd core of the anime. Now, we are aware that Uetsu Nimaiya had single-handedly wiped out all of the Schutzstaffel, taking down the likes of Lil, Askin, and Gerard. His one-shot streak had ended after we had found out that Askin wasn't quite dead yet. The fact that Askin had survived after being attacked by Nimaiya helps to open up a fascinating discussion about how his unique characteristics perfectly complement his lethal ability. We learn that Askin's Schrift, the Deathdealing, necessitates that he needs to endure an extraordinary amount of damage before he can effectively utilize the power of his own Schrift. Interestingly, Askin seems to have an innate capacity for surviving attacks that would be fatal to others. He even survived a direct slash to the throat from Nimaiya. Askin comments on how Yhwach had chosen him specifically to wield the Deathdealing because of his remarkable endurance. It seems as though this aspect of his character had existed even before he had received his Schrift from Yhwach. I wish that this area of his character was explored a bit more, as I'd love to know more about Askin's backstory. The creator of the Zanpakuto, Nimaiya, becomes the first character within Bleach who witnesses Askin utilize his Schrift, the Deathdealing. The Sternritter demonstrates his ability to calculate and manipulate the lethal dose of any substance, a skill that he chillingly exhibits by drinking his own blood, which is gushing from his neck wound. This action immediately ends up weakening Nimaiya, as Askin uses the Deathdealing to reduce the lethal blood dose within Uetsu Nimaiya's body, turning his own blood into a toxic substance for him. The specifics of how blood could become lethal in this way are not entirely explained. In real-world applications, problems can arise when there is too much volume of blood. This is called hypovolemia. It's also known as fluid overload, and it occurs through renal failure, heart failure, liver failure, and also from excessive sodium intake. Hypovolemia is characterized by high blood pressure, swelling within the body, and in general, discomfort within the body like cramps, headaches, and even stomach bloating. The Deathdealing allows Askin to manipulate the threshold of toxicity of blood, so he's not altering the volume of blood within the body. Instead, he is effectively turning a normal volume of blood into a lethal substance. Askin realizes the futility of explaining this to the soon-to-be deceased Nimaiya as he abandons his explanation, but suddenly he is then killed in one shot by Nimaiya. This is easily one of my favorite one-hit KOs in all of Bleach. The hype clip from this manga panel is incredibly deceptive because we know how things play out after this. Coming back onto subject, altering the toxicity of a substance is just one of the abilities that this Schrift power possesses. The Deathdealing is utilized again by Askin in chapter 635 when he is being chased by Grimmjow, and it's here where we are introduced to another aspect of the Deathdealing's power. This involves poison manipulation. This ability is actually foreshadowed within two different instances slightly earlier on in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, specifically in chapter 543, where during what was about to become a fight between Hashward and Bazbi, Askin creates a strange orb that prevents the two of them from clashing. This orb was so dangerous that both Hashward and Bazbi avoided making contact with it, which in my opinion really speaks as to how powerful the Deathdealing really is. Another instance is in chapter 635, where Askin decides to mess with Grimmjow for whatever reason as he makes him chase after him. Just as he does with Hashward and Bazbi, he releases a very similar orb towards Grimmjow's direction. Grimmjow does actually make contact with the orb as he brushes it aside, but he then realizes its true power a second too late. After making contact with it, Grimmjow goes unconscious. This is where Askin refers to the ball as his gift as he reveals that it was actually poison. The specifics of this particular poison attack are unknown, but the poison was strong enough to knock out Grimmjow, which is definitely worth noting. The Deathdealing was so potent that it was in fact the Schrift ability which ended up defeating the most characters within the final arc. Askin often pretends to be much weaker than he really is, but he proves himself to be one of the biggest threats amongst the Quincy. He successfully incapacitates true Shikai Ichigo with a ability that he calls the Poison Bath. Ignoring the fact that Ichigo was holding back his true power until he had fought Yhwach, this is still an impressive feat from Askin. The Poison Bath also affects Orihime and Chad, as he explains that this technique is also an aspect of his Schrift, the Deathdealing, as he explains that this allows him to create an area where resistance to any substance is lowered. Fascinatingly, this ability doesn't seem to have lethal potential on its own, but it does link back to what he was explaining to Nemaya earlier, where he states that he needs to consume a substance in large quantities in order to effectively manipulate it. So if he desires to kill his enemy, then he needs to take time out in order to ingest massive amounts of a substance that he desires to manipulate. This is a very challenging thing to accomplish, as it leaves Askin open to attack until he has taken in enough of the substance for his ability to Deathdealing to work. This is by far one of the major weaknesses of his Schrift ability. This is why his ability Poison Bath allows him to buy enough time to activate the Deathdealing. Yoriichi does suggest to Askin that it would be easier for him to weaken his opponents to the point where they are nearly dead, and then he can just use Poison Bath in order to eliminate them, but Askin believes that he is too good to do that, and he would rather use the full lethal variant of his Schrift power. Up until this point in the video, the Deathdealing has shown itself to be very impressive, but it also appears to possess specific inherent weaknesses. Kubo has done a very good job in maintaining a sense of balance when it comes to this Schrift ability. This is in contrast to some of the overpowered, broken Schrifts that some of the other Schutzstaffel members possess. However, there is a bit more to the Deathdealing that we haven't touched upon, as this power appears again during Askin's battle against Yoriichi and Yushiro. Right off of the bat, Yoriichi makes quick work of Askin as she lands a devastating Raijin Senkai blast on him, which appears to have finished him off, but the Quincy surprisingly survives the attack, only to be met with an even more cruel assault by Yushiro, as this assault is what opens the door to one of my favorite power reveals in the story. Similar to a cockroach who doesn't know when to give up, Askin gets right back up and draws our attention to some words that he had shared with us a few chapters ago. He once again explains that his Schrift ability allows him to manipulate the lethal doses of any substance that he has ingested huge amounts of. This explanation itself has many implications subtly woven into it. After literally consuming a lethal dose of whatever substance he desires, he actually gains immunity over it. In this situation, he ingested a lethal dose of Yushiro and Yoriichi's Reiatsu, as he then becomes completely immune to it. Within the world of Bleach, being immune to somebody's Reiatsu is pretty much a victory signal. Reiatsu is the currency that is used within the battles of Bleach, and even your non-supernatural attacks like physical slashes would require you to exert enough Reiatsu in order to overcome your opponents in order to hurt them. So if an opponent has gained complete immunity to all of your powers and your abilities, then unfortunately you're not going to win that fight. Tite. This highlights how ridiculously overpowered the Deathdealing really is. While it's not as broken as the X-Axis or as ridiculous as Gerard's The Miracle, the Deathdealing is an ability that weaponizes the very mechanics behind the power system of Bleach. When Askin combines this with his lethal control of poison, he is almost unstoppable. I say almost because Urahara then appears and he is able to trigger Yoruichi's God of Thunder transformation as she acquires a counter to the Deathdealing. Askin's Schrift ability doesn't give him immunity to Reiatsu as a concept, but only the Reiatsu of that individual whose power that he has endured. So after Yoruichi gains a form which allows her to change a Reiatsu quicker than Askin can gain immunity to it, it removes his immunity from the equation. Think of it as the flu shot. During the winter season, you'll get a flu shot which will protect you from the variant of the flu from that particular year, but as flu strains evolve, it requires you to then get a top-up flu shot the next year in order to protect you from the new, more prevalent strain that is going around. While in a real-world scenario, we have several months to prepare for flu season. In the context of Askin's battle against Yoruichi, he had little to no time to develop immunity to Yoruichi's constantly changing Reiatsu. Now, despite this temporary advantage, Askin ends up activating his holy form, as this then allows him to figure out Reiatsu at its most basic level, enabling him to retain his immunity against an individual's Reiatsu, even if the Reiatsu ends up changing. With his holy form activated, it also takes him a shorter amount of time to gain immunity over a specific substance. He then also pulls off his biggest technique, which is called Gift Ball Deluxe. He creates a oversized gift ball around his body. It is so big that it engulfs multiple buildings in the surrounding area, as this is one of the largest gift balls that Askin is able to create. This ability was so potent that it had forced Urahara down to a single knee as he had started to sweat. In order to make sure that his victims remain trapped within the gift ball, he places several interconnected spheres of light called the Poison Realm on the outermost barrier of the Gift Ball Deluxe. The inclusion of Poison Realm makes it virtually impossible to escape the Gift Ball Deluxe. So while nobody is able to exit the Gift Ball, the Poison Realm does not prevent people from entering. This weakness can allow an opponent who is outside of the barrier to catch Askin off guard with a surprise attack. The Gift Ball Deluxe allows Askin to increase the poison concentration even further as the shape of the Gift Ball Deluxe alters, becoming more and more narrower as it progressively forms into a tip. Askin subconsciously is able to restrict the power of the Gift Ball Deluxe because he is afraid of his own power affecting himself too. Unfortunately, this is all that we see of the Gift Ball Deluxe until Askin is killed by Grimmjow. This is explained off as Askin was not immune to Grimmjow's Reiatsu, so he was able to sneak into the Gift Ball Deluxe and thus able to deliver a fatal blow from behind, literally impaling him with Grimmjow's signature one-handed impale as he tears out his heart, holding it in his hand. So as powerful and potent as the Deathdealing was, one of its main weaknesses is simply facing off against a large enough attack from someone whose Reiatsu that Askin is not immune to. I do believe that Askin's battle was rushed in the end, and he most certainly deserved way more screen time than he had gotten. I am very confident that the final battle between Urahara and Askin will definitely be expanded upon in the anime, and I don't think that this is the last that we've seen of the Deathdealing. It was definitely a fantastic power which was worthy of being showcased during the endgame of the 1000-year Blood War arc. Both Askin and the Deathdealing deserved much better within the manga, and I'm really looking forward to more anime exclusive scenes involving Askin and his Schrift power. Sternritter Eat the Explode Bambietta Bastarbine possesses a Schrift bestowed upon her by Yhwach, which allows her to generate powerful explosives. Bambietta's abilities are prominently showcased during a battle against Komamura, and unlike many of the other Sternritter whose Schrift abilities are based upon complex scientific principles or reality-bending feats, Bambietta's powers are relatively straightforward and they are very easy to understand. So in this video, I'm going to be analysing and breaking down everything that there is to know about Bambietta's Schrift, including how it operates, and exploring whether if her abilities are affected by her zombification. Be sure to stick around until the very end of this video, as I'll also be revealing exclusive information about Bambietta's Schrift from the Can't Fear Homeworld light novels when she goes up against opponents like Hikone. These Sternritter are a group of elite soldiers amongst the Wandenreich, and there are roughly 26 members who have each been granted a Schrift personally from Yhwach. A Schrift or a script refers to the unique powers of a specific Quincy which is awoken after receiving a portion of Yhwach's power directly. Schrift abilities typically enhance the natural talents that a Quincy already possesses. When a Quincy dies, the powers that have been bestowed upon them by Yhwach return to him. But in the case of Bambietta Bastarbine, because she never truly dies and she's in a zombified undead state, her Schrift did not end up returning to Yhwach. Bambietta's Schrift the Explode is one of the more straightforward abilities among the Quincy, as it allows her to transform any reishi that she touches into bombs. For those unfortunate enough to be on the receiving end of her attacks, it can result in their very skin being turned into an explosive. During the 1000-Year Blood War arc, Bambietta plays a significant role in both the first and second Quincy invasions. Her battle against Seijin Komamura stands out as one of the most thrilling fights in the series, and it showcases Komamura utilizing his humanization technique in order to counteract her explosives. In this video, I'll begin by breaking down the abilities of the Explode and how it functions during Bambietta's key battles. I'll also explore how her Schrift changes when she enters her holy form, the ultimate form of a Quincy that greatly enhances that ability to manipulate spirit particles. In her holy form or her Volstandig, Bambietta's Schrift is amplified and she gains 2 wings and a halo which are made from spirit particles. Additionally, I'll also be talking about the weaknesses of this Schrift ability and how her abilities are affected by her zombification. Like all Quincy's, Bambietta's combat effectiveness hinges on her ability to manipulate reishi. Reishi are the spiritual energy particles that compose all spiritual beings and objects in spiritual dimensions. Bambietta's intense battle with Komamura unfolds in chapters 554 to 557. This is where we gain critical insights into how her abilities work. It's important to note that Bambietta only releases her Schrift after all of these stolen Bankai are returned to their respective Shinigami. In chapter 554, Yhwach grants the Sternritter the ability to activate their holy forms, and Bambietta reveals that they were unable to use this power while in possession of the Shinigami's Bankai. When Shinji attempts to confuse Bambietta by activating his Zanpakuto Sakanade, she simply counters him with an explosion. This demonstrates the overwhelming power of her ability. Even though Bambietta admits that she can't discern directions due to Sakanade's effects, she declares that she can just blast in every single direction and thus neutralize the threat of Shinji. As Bambietta continues to unleash her explosive attacks, Hinamori tries to intervene only to be stopped by Komamura. Komamura warns that Bambietta's bombs are far too powerful for Momo to neutralize with her Zanpakuto. This interaction highlights the devastating power of her Schrift, which is strong enough to challenge even captains and lieutenants. When Komamura struggles to withstand the force of Bambietta's explosions, she takes the opportunity to explain how her Schrift the Explode works. Bambietta reveals that her attacks are unblockable, and this isn't because the bombs themselves are composed of spirit particles, but because her Schrift allows her to transform anything her reishi touches into a bomb, and this is effective for organic or inorganic matter. As Bambietta unleashes another barrage of bombs, Komamura's armor is completely obliterated, and it reveals his true human form underneath it. In order to counter Bambietta's Schrift, Komamura is forced to unleash his Bankai Kokujo Tengen Myo Dangaijo. This is the only effective countermeasure against Bambietta's ability. Komamura explains that his Bankai typically manifests as a suit of armor brought to life. However, in its Dangaijo form, the Bankai sheds its armor, leaving only pure exposed Reiatsu. This transformation renders Bambietta's attacks ineffective against it. Confused by this turn of events, Bambietta reasserts her belief that her Schrift should be able to turn anything a Reiatsu touches into a bomb, including Komamura's now giant Bankai. However, Komamura, having cast aside his life by removing the armor from his Bankai, explains that he has nothing left to fear. Even when Bambietta tries to strike Komamura directly, her bombs fail to affect him, as his Bankai again is immune to her attacks and it deflects them with ease. In the enhanced form of the Explode, Bambietta is able to release endless spheres of reishi bombs using her Explode ability. ability. These bombs are released from under her wings and it sends multiple explosions into the area around her. A single explosion is enough to combat captain class individuals like Komamura and Shinji. One of the main weaknesses of the explode is revealed during Giselle's fight against Mayuri. When the zombified corpse of Bambietta appears on the battlefield, Mayuri is able to deflect her attacks within 3 seconds by using spirit particle suspension devices. These are devices that can cause any spirit particles that they come into contact with to cease all activity for a specific length of time. So when Bambietta's attacks are launched, the suspension devices neutralize the spirit particles, thus preventing them from becoming bombs. Another limitation of Bambietta's Schrift is demonstrated during a fight with Komamura. Her explosive attacks can be neutralized if they are met with enough force. Within the Can't Fear Unworld light novels, it's revealed that some of the Sternritter were either captured or had taken refuge within Hueco Mundo. Bambietta belongs to the latter group as she was hiding alongside Lil Toto and Giselle. Lil Toto observes that Bambietta's mental state is deteriorating, though she remains capable of utilizing her Schrift the Explode, and she can still fight against average Arrancar or Hollow opponents. During her battle with Rudbon's soldiers in Hueco Mundo, Bambietta attempts to use the Explode against his Arrancar soldiers, but despite her increasingly reckless bombing tactics, she struggles to keep up with the overwhelming numbers of enemies. Loli and Minoli comment that Bambietta's strength is comparable to that of Kilgay Oppi. Rudbon notes that Bambietta's Reishi has the ability to turn anything that it touches into explosives. Bambietta's Reishi itself does not inherently possess explosive properties, and it can be fired rapidly. Rudbon deduces that waiting for Bambietta to exhaust her spiritual pressure would be an unwise strategy. He then uses his Zanpakuto Arbol's ability Calvaraz to absorb the Reishi in Hueco Mundo through his roots, creating an endless supply of loyal soldiers. The sheer number of newly created Skull Soldiers eventually outpaces Bambietta's ability to destroy them with her explosions. Later within the light novels, when Tokinara travels to the Valley of Screams, the Quincy's engage in battle with Hikone. Bambietta tries to attack Hikone by sending several spheres of Reishi towards him, and when Hikone touches these Reishi bombs, they trigger a chain of explosions. From these encounters in the light novels, it becomes clear that the Explode remains just as powerful even in Bambietta's zombified state. However, against an opponent like Hikone, the damage inflicted is minimal. This is due to Hikone's remarkable recovery abilities, which are similar to those of Hollows, thus allowing him to rapidly regenerate. During Bambietta's attack on the Hollow Ikomikidomoe, she unleashes a massive barrage of Reishi from her hand. This attack is described as a Reishi light, and it transforms into a rain of explosive fire when it reaches Ikomikidomoe. Bambietta's Schrift is a fitting reflection of her personality. She is a vindictive, vengeful, and petulant individual who always demands to have things her way. Even in a zombified state, Bambietta can effectively utilize her Schrift, but because of her diminished mental capacity, it does cause her Reishi bombs to be scattered haphazardly. One of the most striking aspects of Bambietta's Schrift is its straightforward nature. Unlike more complex or psychological powers such as Asnod's the Fear, which manipulates perception, or Gremmy's the Visionary, which alters reality, the Explode is just direct and forceful. I would categorize Bambietta's ability alongside others like Lil Toto's the Glutton, or Driscoll Bercy's the Overkill, and even Meninas's Schrift called the Power. These are all abilities designed for direct impact, and they become even more powerful when the user activates their holy form. Since Bambietta survives by the end of the series, it's intriguing to consider whether if Kubo might bring a character back in the Hell arc. Her power, despite its simplicity, is very powerful and it matches her aggressive disposition. Yhwach's Sternritter army consists of ruthless and merciless killers, as each of them has an unwavering loyalty to the Quincy Emperor. Amongst these Sternritter, very few can inflict inflict psychological terror as effectively as Sternritter F the Fear Asnod. Asnod plays a major role in both the first and second Quincy invasions, where his Schrift the Fear is prominently showcased during his battles against Byakuya and Rukia. In today's video, I'll be delving into the terrifying capabilities of the Fear and how Asnod's holy form amplifies these formidable powers. What makes Asnod's Schrift so memorable is its abstract nature. It doesn't rely upon brute strength or science-based techniques like the other Schrifts. Instead, Asnod's Schrift preys on the psychological vulnerability of his targets by instilling an overwhelming sense of fear within them. In addition to breaking down the Fear, I'll also have a look at Asnod's backstory before he became a Sternritter, as this offers critical insights into how the Fear was created. Asnod is a member of the Sternritter, one of the elite soldiers within Yhwach's Vandenreich army. As a member of this powerful group, he wields a Quincy holy form as well as a Schrift. A Schrift is a unique power bestowed upon a Quincy after receiving a portion of Yhwach's power. This enhances the natural ability of that Quincy. When a Quincy dies, their Schrift returns to Yhwach, and Asnod's Schrift is known as the Fear. It's a particularly terrifying ability. In chapter 501, Kubo illustrates how Asnod uses thorns made of reishi in order to wound Byakuya, thus imbuing him with an overwhelming sensation of helplessness and anxiety. This scene effectively sets the tone for the rest of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, as it demonstrates the true danger that Sternritter pose to even the most powerful of characters in the series. When Byakuya is paralyzed after being struck by the Fear, he becomes incredibly vulnerable to attack and is subsequently attacked by his own Bankai Senbonzakura. This moment highlights the Sternritter's status as serious threats within Bleach. Asnod's battle with Rukia begins in chapters 566 to 570. Here we learn that the Fear affects living beings on a deep psychological level, penetrating their very essence. This sets the stage for Rukia to unleash her Bankai Hakano Togame, allowing her to gradually expose the weaknesses in Asnod's Schrift through her sheer force of will. Now, what makes Asnod's character so compelling is the way that Kubo visually represents the terror of the Fear. When Asnod activates his holy form, the Fear becomes even more powerful, as it transforms him into a grotesque and repulsive figure whose speech and behavior become both increasingly erratic and unhinged. For this video, I'll be analyzing how the Fear operates in its base form before going into how it is enhanced after Asnod activates his holy form. And then lastly, I'll explore all of the weaknesses of the Fear as we break down and analyze everything that there is to know about this Schrift ability. In chapter 501, Asnod explains to Byakuya how the Fear operates. He reveals that a single strike from one of his thorns is enough to instill terror into any ordinary Shinigami. This is a terror that is so intense that it could cause their heart to burn with strain. Asnod goes on to say that once someone falls victim to his arrows, they begin to find fear in everything around them. This overwhelming paranoia prevents them from thinking or acting rationally. When Byakuya attempts to maintain control over his emotions through sheer willpower, he is confronted with a vision of a corpse of Rukia, thus causing him to waver in doubt. Asnod acknowledges Byakuya's strength in resisting and admits that it is possible to suppress rational fear by attacking its source. However, he emphasizes that true fear is not born from reason but from instinct. He then uses the analogy of swarming insects to illustrate that true fear is inescapable because it is an inherent part of human instinct. We are wired to fear that which cannot be explained. During Asnod's battle against Rukia in chapter 566, his reishi thorns begin to emit a black substance upon contact with a surface. When one of these thorns strikes Rukia, the black substance touches her skin and immediately induces fear within her mind. Asnod explains that Rukia's ice cannot prevent his Schrift from affecting her. In the following chapter, he elaborates that a Schrift does not need to invade the body through open wounds, as it only needs to lightly brush against the skin of its victim before it melts and seeps into their body. In essence, this is an ability that cannot be blocked by any conventional means. Asnod then provides a lengthy exposition on the relationship between fear and comfort. He concludes that all living beings go through life life with a primary goal of evading fear, which makes it impossible for anyone to be entirely unaffected by fear as long as they are alive. This fundamental truth underscores the inescapable nature of Asnod's ability, thus making it one of the most terrifying powers in all of Bleach. Asnod's holy form, called Tartarphorus, which translates to Afraid of God, is revealed within chapter 568. After being frozen by Rukia, Asnod begins to reflect on whether if he is finally experiencing fear for the first time. In a surprising turn of events, he then loudly declares that his only true fear is the prospect of being rebuked by Yhwach and having his entire being taken from him. Compared to this overwhelming terror, Asnod claims that the pain and fear of battle are insignificant to him. When Asnod's body begins to transform, it takes on a more grotesque and horrifying appearance, with blood streaming from his blank eyes and his body becoming emaciated, marked by a vertical stitch running down his torso. In this monstrous form, his Schrift ability is amplified to an even greater extent. It is revealed that as long as Rukia continues to look at Asnod, she will remain under the influence of the fear. This is because her nervous system is still active, thus allowing Tartarphorus to penetrate her body through the optic nerves and instill fear into her. The many tiny eyes that cover Asnod's body make it impossible for Rukia to escape his gaze. No matter where she turns, Asnod's eyes follow her, ensuring that she cannot avoid his terrifying presence. Even though Rukia's body is in a frozen state, her nerves continue to function, making her vulnerable to his fear-inducing power. Asnod taunts Rukia, explaining that even if she closes her eyes, the memories of fear will continue to haunt her mind. As Rukia struggles to resist, the fear begins to evoke memories of her loved ones, including Byakuya, Ichigo, and Orihime. This further intensifies the psychological torment that she experiences. This moment highlights the overwhelming power of Asnod's ability, which not only targets the senses, but also preys on the emotional connections and memories of his victims. Asnod's grotesque transformation amplifies the fear that he instills in his victims. In chapter 569, the stitches across his body tear open in order to reveal a distorted and terrifying face, and it's much larger and more disproportionate than before. The remains of his former body dangle from his chin, while the lower half of his body is now composed of fleshy tendrils instead of legs, thus adding to his overall monstrous appearance. Thanks to Rukia's Bankai, it grants her the ability to temporarily enter a state of death, and this ultimately proves to be the key to counteracting Asnod's Schrift ability. By essentially nullifying her own life functions, Rukia is able to resist the fear that Asnod induces. Additionally, as their battle nears towards its end, Byakuya advises Rukia that if they can eliminate fear from their own hearts, then they will see nothing in Asnod but his own insecurity, which is reflected back at him. This revelation emphasizes that the fear he wields is rooted in psychological perception and can be overcome through sheer willpower and inner strength. In chapter 570, we gain insight into Asnod's past. As a human, he suffered from a chronic illness that left him in constant pain and unable to breathe properly. His condition made him acutely aware of his own mortality, filling him with dread at the thought of death. He reflects on his upbringing, which appears to be a religious one, and he fears the possibility of going to hell after death. In his moment of vulnerability, Yhwach appears before him and grants a portion of his power to him. This transforms Asnod into a Sternritter with the Schrift the Fear. This Schrift is a direct manifestation of Asnod's own feelings of helplessness and terror at the prospect of dying. All of this is illustrated very well in later panels, where Asnod repeatedly expresses his fear, highlighting the deep connection between his abilities and his own personal history. The Fear is undoubtedly one of the most unsettling powers in Bleach, as it offers a deep look into the psychological states of both Rukia and Byakuya. Rukia's battle against Asnod served as a crucial moment for her own development, allowing us to witness some of the most impressive character designs, particularly in Asnod's chilling transformations, along with Rukia's excellent Bankai. During the battle against Rukia, I love how the Fear operates by targeting her nerves. It added a fascinating layer of tension to the unfolding battle, and overall
Overall, Asnod stands out as one of the most memorable mini-villains within the 1000-Year Blood War arc due to the psychological horror element of his ability. While his time within the story was very brief, thanks to his Schrift ability, it had left a lasting impression upon all of us.
Sternritter G. Lil Toto Lompard stands out as one of the most visually striking members of Yhwach's army. Her Schrift power, the Glutton, grants her a grotesque but terrifyingly effective ability as she can massively distort her mouth, expanding it to engulf and devour anything or anyone in her path. This isn't just for show though, as her devouring capability is both wide-reaching and lethal. An unfortunate side effect of this ability is that no matter how much she eats, she will always be left craving more. The Glutton goes beyond just consumption, as in the Can't Fear Unworld light novels, it is revealed that Lil Toto doesn't simply eat her targets, she temporarily gains knowledge and access to their abilities also. Once she ingests somebody, her body instinctively understands how to replicate their powers, at least until the reishi of the person that she has devoured has been fully digested. This secondary trait of the Glutton makes her not only a devourer of enemies, but also an excellent mimicker of their strengths. When consuming hollows, Lil Toto is actually absorbing reishi which is toxic to Quincy's. Hollow reishi typically acts like a poison in a Quincy's body, so ordinarily it would be fatal, but thanks to her Schrift, Lil Toto is able to endure it. If not for her Schrift ability, taking in that type of energy would likely paralyze or even kill her outright. Her resilience and grotesque power make her one of the more complex and dangerous Sternritter, who is capable not only of overwhelming her opponents, but also turning their own power against them.
Sternritter H, the Heat Bazb. The power of his Schrift is one of the first that we are introduced to during the 1000-Year Blood War arc, and it's interesting how his abilities raise more questions than answers. In this video, I'm going to be talking about everything that we know about Bazb Schrift the Heat, explaining its origins and the abilities that it gives him, paying specific attention towards the burner fingers. When the concept of Quincy was first introduced into the story, it's worth noting that our only example of a Quincy was Uryu, and he didn't exhibit some of these incredible powers that we would come to see later on during the 1000-Year Blood War arc. Before this arc, the Quincy weren't even a they to begin with, as we were only aware of Ryuken and Uryu as being the only surviving Quincy. Uryu was the first Quincy we were introduced to, and he had stated that he was the last of his kind. His spiritual powers, while impressive, were rather simple abilities that had hinged on the natural Quincy ability to subjugate and control reishi. This power was typically translated into the second main Quincy ability, the power to create and use spirit weapons. Additionally, they also had their own traversal ability called Haren Hyaku, and the power to detect and sense spiritual energy. All of these powers, showcased by Uryu, would come to be known as the conventional Quincy abilities throughout the story until the 1000-Year Blood War arc, where Kubo had decided to evolve the Quincy into something truly formidable. It was quite a feat to implement this into the story by Kubo, as he would boost the powers of the Quincy, who were kind of depicted to be the weaker race within the world of Bleach, especially when you think back to how they were all eradicated by the Shinigami 200 years ago, meaning that they don't really compare much to the power of the Gotei 13 and its Shinigami. The Quincy, as we had known them, would also be no match for Aizen's Arrancar army, so understandably Kubo had to do something to up the stakes and to make the Quincy feel like a worthy threat for the final arc of the story. Within the 1000-Year Blood War arc, we are revealed to the king and the father of the Quincy race, Yhwach. We find out that he was alive all of this time, and he has been slowly building an army of Quincy, waiting for his time to exact his revenge upon the Soul Society for defeating them over 1000 years ago during their first war. I love how Kubo had implemented this all new group of Quincy into the story. You realize that they are a totally different faction stemming from the Quincy race. They had evolved and separated from the main group of Quincy 1000 years ago, so they had no longer adhered to the norms of what a Quincy should look and fight like. After Yhwach and his army had fled into the shadows 1000 years ago, we were left with the original Quincy, who were strictly composed of archers. We know that the Ishida family and Kurosaki family had stemmed from this group of orthodox Quincy, while nearly all of them were killed 200 years ago, and it was thanks to Soken Ishida that the traditions of the orthodox Quincy were passed down to the next generation. And if you've been paying attention to the exclusive scenes within the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime, you'll know that Soken Ishida had recorded the history of the Quincy king and how he and his army were defeated 1000 years ago. Yhwach's soldiers fight with a variety of different weapons in addition to their archery. The Sternritters were the first users of Blutveen and Blut archery within the story. We do later learn from Ishin that Masaki had this ability, and she would have used it against the Grand Fisher if her powers were not stolen from her by Yhwach. The Blood abilities are a versatile set of powers that uses the reishi systems within a Quincy to enhance either their offensive or defensive power. Yhwach's army had also developed more impressive variations of abilities, as they had replaced the Quincy Let Steal ability with a far more powerful and sustainable holy form. This transformation does away with the heavy drawbacks of Let Steal, and it grants its users even more flexibility in its use. Yhwach's army still held on to some of the abilities originated from the Orthodox Quincy, like the power of Ranso Tengai, which was demonstrated by Kilgeopi. So out of all of these new powers and fighting styles that Yhwach's army would gain, the one that had stood out amongst all of them was the Quincy Schrift. These are terrifying new powers that grant the Sternritters with abilities outside of the scope of traditional Quincy powers. We learn that the leader of the Quincy, Yhwach, had bestowed upon all of his Sternritters a specific Schrift or a letter. This is the source of their new abilities, which help to make the Quincy a worthy adversary during the final arc. These new powers are represented by different letters of the alphabet. The actual word Schrift literally translates to letter or writing, and this is no coincidence, and in order to give these powers, Yhwach must literally inscribe this letter onto the soul of the designated Sternritter. It results in a power manifesting, and its name is derived from the letter that has been given to them. It isn't clear whether if Yhwach chooses the abilities that will be born through the letter that he engraves onto their souls. The leader of the Quincy is able to do this because of his innate ability to split and share pieces of his soul. Bazz-B had benefited greatly by having a Schrift inscribed into his soul. He is of course the childhood friend of Hashwad, who prior to joining Yhwach's army had been unconsciously empowering Bazz-B. He was enhancing his power, so much so to the point that Bazz-B would begin to believe that he was a one-of-a-kind genius. This idea, however, would shatter after he learns the truth that his power, or at least the talent that he had prided himself with, was a result of Hashwad empowering him through his special ability to share his soul. As we learn, in addition to Yhwach, the only other Quincy who can share a piece of himself is Hashwad. So while Bazz-B's ego was deflated quite a bit, in the future he would receive a power that he would call his own from Yhwach, and this would lead to him successfully becoming a Sternritter. Yhwach had designated him with the letter H for the heat. It gives him the ability to manipulate, create, and use varying manifestations of fire and heat. Now this is a Schrift that in all honesty has no business being as mysterious as it had seemed, since its scale and power seems to rather fluctuate throughout the story. In order to understand Bazz-B's Schrift, we'll go over all of the different powers and forms that his Schrift exhibits within the story. Bazz-B's power, the heat, is first revealed within chapter 494 of the manga, and in episode 3 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime. He showcases it during the Quincy's first invasion of the Soul Society. We learn that the Quincy were not breaking into the Serite, but they were within it the whole time, hiding within the shadows. Several members of Squad 3, including Izurukira, had expected the Quincy to arrive from the outside gates of the Soul Society. While waiting at the gate, a large pillar of reishi would erupt in front of them, and it would reveal Bazz-B, who would immediately blow a massive hole through Kira's chest with his power Burner Finger 1. The Sternritter would once again use Burner Finger 1 to kill another member of Squad 3, and it's at this point that it becomes clear that Bazz-B's Burner Finger 1 functions like a laser beam that concentrates a great amount of heat within his index finger as he shoots it out. Now it's easy to come to a conclusion of Burner Finger 1's power because whenever he uses it, it has a similar effect to all of his targets. From when he takes out a low tier lieutenant like Kira, to how he effortlessly melts Hitsugaya's ice, as well as piercing his body multiple times with his power. He is also able to take out multiple Sternritters like Nanana in chapter 623, Alil Toto, Meninas, and Giselle within chapter 584. But the truly terrifying aspect about this ability is the fact that literally nobody in the story has ever been able to block this attack, and this gets even more insane when you consider the fact that powerful characters like True Shikai Ichigo and even Hashwad didn't even bother to take this attack head on. It was that threatening that they had found it necessary to dodge the Burner Finger 1. In Hashwad's case, Bazz-B had lost a great deal of power as well as his ability to use his holy form, and even in such a handicapped state, Hashwad still had avoided the attack, and we learned that it ends up making him bleed even though it slightly grazes the side of his head as he had tried to dodge it. And even Ichigo had implied that had he been hit by Bazz-B's Burner Finger 1, then he would have been severely injured. It's amazing how such a small and usually overlooked ability has proven to exhibit such devastating effects, especially when used by a character who isn't anywhere near as hyped up as some of these Sternritter Sternritters are in terms of power. But I think by shining a light on some of these few details, it really does help us to understand Bazb's power and to truly appreciate his Schrift the Heat. I think that it's also worthwhile to mention that Bazb was able to offset the flames of Yamamoto's Shikai within chapter 506. He had used flames generated from his Schrift in order to protect himself, and it is revealed within the Can't For Your Own World light novels that Yamamoto's flames, even in its Shikai state, had far exceeded the powers of every member of the Gotei 13. So having defended himself from Yamamoto's Shikai flames, it is truly an incredible feat demonstrated by Bazb. Now his second technique is called Burner Finger 2. Now this is another interesting power that he possesses. He uses it against Hitsugaya once during their fight, and he uses it to deal incapacitating damage to him, slicing him through his Zanpakuto and ending their fight. He had also used it a couple of times during his battle against Hashward within chapter 631. Now it's an ability that involves coating his index finger and middle finger with his flames, and making a slashing motion towards his target. Now this attack understandably has a very strong cutting effect while also burning his target at the same time. His third technique is once again creatively called Burner Finger 3, which is honestly one of his least accomplished abilities, and it's only surpassed by his last two in how little we know of their function. It's a power that allows him to create lava by heating any solid object with his spiritual energy, which is a rather straightforward power, but it's still a good application of it, with it increasing his versatility in combat, and a degree of protection is also given to him as it prevents his opponents from coming near him, while also using it to negate any environmental advantages his opponent may have in combat, like the elemental powers of Hitsugaya or even Rukia. Now I really wish that Bazb was a bit more creative with his names, because his fourth technique is called Burner Finger 4, and by extending his four fingers and shaping his hand like a blade, a massive sword of flames would form around his arm, which he uses to effortlessly burn and cut his targets. Now this technique is very similar to Black Goku's Energy Blade technique. In Bazb's case, this power was slightly disappointing the first time that it was used against Renji, as we only see a massive explosion without much of an explanation as to how this power works or what actual ability it gives him. And the next time that we see it is against Hashward, and we quickly understand that it functions more like a regular sword and is aimed mainly at enhancing his destructive capabilities. Now considering the fact that Burner Finger 2 already did something very similar, there's only so much that could have been done with Burner Finger 4, and its very destructive power does outclass the raw power of the other three Burner Fingers, so it definitely has a solid place within his arsenal of techniques. Now his final technique is called Burning Full Fingers. Thank God he didn't name it Burner Finger 5, so at least this one gets some points for creativity, and to perform this technique he shoots a spiral of flames from each of his fingers that most likely incinerate his target. Unfortunately we don't see the outcome and effect of this technique, as Hashward would immediately cut him down right after he had used it.
Sternritter I, the Iron known as Kangdu, possesses the Schrift which allows him to encase his body in a durable iron-like armor. This ability grants him exceptional defense, making him one of the more physically powerful members of the Sternritter. Within chapter 559 of the manga, Kangdu activates the iron during his execution, and he uses it to survive a direct strike from Hashward's blade. This is a truly impressive feat which demonstrates just how tough his defensive capabilities are. The anime expands upon this ability with anime-exclusive scenes which highlight its offensive applications too. Within episode 4 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime, we do see Kangdu coat his arm in iron mid-battle, thus enabling him to not only shatter Hitsugaya's ice attacks, but also send the young captain flying back with impressive force. This visual enhancement emphasizes that the iron isn't limited to defense alone, as it gives Kangdu a powerful edge in close quarters combat, allowing him to simultaneously endure damage as well as deliver devastating blows. One of the most striking and memorable Schrift abilities during the early portions of the 1000-Year Blood War arc is Kilgei Oppi's The Jail. We see this power first showcased just as Ichigo is attempting to leave Hueco Mundo as he heads out to the Soul Society. In a desperate move, Kilgei Oppi unleashes a massive surge of Reishi which creates an impenetrable barrier which traps Ichigo within the dimensional pathway that connects the two realms together. What makes the jail terrifying is how it lingers around even after Kilgei is defeated. The prison remains fully intact, leaving Ichigo completely isolated. The trap is so powerful that his spiritual pressure becomes undetectable, cutting off all communication with his allies. Ichigo, despite his immense power, is rendered helpless here, as he is unable to break through even with a blast from his Bankai. It is only when Ichigo awakens his dormant Quincy abilities that he is finally able to destroy the cage and escape from Kilge's Schrift. This feat alone highlights the insane power of the jail if it's used against the right opponent.
There is a popular saying that everyone, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, no matter what they do, are deserving of love. Now, it's a powerful statement that highlights the inherent value of every human being, regardless of their background or actions. And I feel like when Kubo had heard this, he had taken it personally, because during the 1000-year Blood War arc, he takes it upon himself to create what I believe is to be the vilest, most repulsive and unlovable character that the Bleach world has ever seen. Kubo, as an absolute master of his craft, unsurprisingly succeeds in creating a character that is universally despised. I'm of course talking about Pepe Wakabrada, a character who I'm sure is loved by many in the Bleach world, but definitely not of their own free will. He in fact possesses one of the most interesting Schrifts among the Sternritter. His power is among one of the many Schrift abilities that could have single-handedly won the war if all of the conditions had remained convenient for it. In general, Pepe's character and his ability are so reviled by fans that he's become somewhat of a running joke within the Bleach community. In this video, I intend to fully examine Pepe's ability, the Love. I will go over every way that it is utilized in the story, as well as speculating how this Schrift works. Pepe's ability, the Love, makes its debut fairly early on in the 1000-year Blood War arc, as it's revealed within chapter 500. While the Shinigami were still reeling from the shock of the onset of the invasion, the Research and Development Institute was trying its best to make sense of the situation and offer some support where it was necessary. Now, this venture would be immediately disrupted as a giant fist would come crushing through the floor. Now, you'd assume that this was an enemy Quincy who had just invaded their lab, but to their surprise and horror, they see the face of none other than the gatekeeper of the Serete, Jidambo. They immediately ask what on earth he is doing, but their questions are answered by a barrage of fists, pulverizing a great number of them and the Research and Development Institute. Now, this is where we see a distant shot of Pepe laughing while this happens, a clear indication that he had a hand in this bizarre event. Also, if I had $1 for every time a villain had taken over the mind of a giant in the Soul Society, I'd have 2. I just find it pretty funny that this has happened twice. All in all, there's not much that we can take away from this initial display of the Love at work. We don't get to see how it's activated or the rules that it operates by, since this was a brief showcase of the ability after the fact. It's interesting to compare the initial use of the Love to how it appears later on in the story, because things are quite different. It leads one to wonder if Kubo hadn't yet decided on how this power would function, or if he had purposefully made it mysterious in order to withhold its true potential. Now, Jidambo's state after being affected by the Love looked more like he was a victim of Sternritter Z the zombie, rather than what the Love would come to look like later on in the 1000-year Blood War arc. He had appeared to be dazed and unconscious, as though not fully awake, and he had attacked and killed his fellow Shinigami. Now, this brief display of Pepe's power was the only one that was seen at this point in the story. However, as the functions of the Love are later revealed, it becomes evident that there is much more to this ability than initially meets the eye. Although the exact mechanics and requirements of how the Love works are difficult to determine, they undoubtedly do exist. We'll discuss this further as we dive into other instances that the Love ability is showcased in the story. The next instance of the Love appearing is in chapter 586, or at the very least that's when I estimate it to have been used. Byakuya, Rukia, Renji and several other lieutenants had intercepted Pepe and 7 other Sternritter who were trying to prevent Ichigo from reaching Yhwach, which leads to a fight breaking out between them. Unfortunately, the events of this fight are all off-screened, but we do see the aftermath of it in chapter 594. It seems as though Byakuya has defeated Candice, Nanana and Robert with almost no effort to boot, as he appears relatively unharmed after fighting 3 very strong opponents. A wounded Meninas and Lil Toto observe him and talk about just how absurdly strong Byakuya has become, even stating how he seems nothing like the guy who got absolutely destroyed by Asnod. Lil Toto then begins to wonder where Pepe has gone and states that his power would have really come in handy at a time like this. While Byakuya was surveying the area for enemies, he was approached by Hisagi, who reports that he has defeated a Sternritter. It's amusing how Hisagi noticed that Byakuya
had already defeated 3 within the same time frame. Now this moment highlights the vast difference in power between a captain and a lieutenant. However, before we can fully appreciate this moment, Byakuya immediately knocks away Hisagi's Zanpakuto, and Kubo draws this panel very skillfully, capturing the shock and confusion on Hisagi's face, and his intentional placement of his artwork in order to make it appear as though Byakuya is the attacker. Now this effectively conveys the confusion surrounding the situation, and it builds up the mystery of it. A confused Hisagi asks Byakuya what's happening, and he even asks if he's alright, but Byakuya responds by stating that it is Hisagi who should be asked that question. While this conversation ensues, their Zanpakuto continue to clash, with Byakuya narrowly dodging a really close swing as he begins to wonder if he was facing an imposter or if Hisagi has fallen under the control of the enemy. In response to these questions, Hisagi remains rather confused as Byakuya asks why he's attacking him. He states that there was no way that he's fallen under the enemy's control. After all, he was doing it all for Lord Pepe. Now this changes into an all-out attack as Hisagi goes into full swing with his attacks. The fight cuts away to Meninas and Lil Toto, who are watching nearby. They immediately recognize this bizarre behavior to be the result of Pepe's presence and realize that he's nearby too. The battle then switches to Pepe, who reveals himself and begins to explain that his power makes all who are touched by it love him unconditionally. He does use some very interesting phrasing that seems to hint at exactly what his ability does, as he explains that his love splits the mind in two, and the two severed halves are rejoined together as one for him. It almost sounds as though he's explaining that his power splits the minds of those it affects and completely rewires it to make them purely subservient to him. It is after his extremely overplayed speech that we finally get to see just how the love is transmitted. In order to use it, he first draws a heart shape with his 2 hands and he gathers reishi within that space, and he then fires off the heart-shaped projectile by thrusting out his arms in that specific shape at his target, and once this heart-shaped projectile makes contact, the love begins to take effect. Interestingly enough, Pepe doesn't aim at Byakuya, but rather at the onlooking Meninas and Lil Toto. Lil Toto narrowly moves out of the way, but by doing so has created the perfect opening for the love's projectile to hit Meninas. It ends up forming a heart-shaped print on her face. Meninas immediately begins to swoon at Pepe and calls him her master, and her arm grows massive as she activates her own shrift, the power, and she punches Lil Toto square in the face. Now this entertains the sadistic Pepe, who explains that if he's able to kill off the other Sternritter, all the glory will be his. The battle between Byakuya and Hisagi continues in chapter 595, as Byakuya continues to masterfully weave out of the way of Hisagi's attacks. Now this is where I had started to understand exactly how the love works. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that it seems slightly weird how Jidambo seemed almost like a zombie in how he had moved and fought when under its control, but it seems like this is a very consistent phenomenon. It's interesting to note that both Hisagi and Meninas had exhibited a similar silent and zombie-like state after being affected by the power of the love, despite appearing to be more present initially. This suggests that the state that Jidambo had fallen into was a natural outcome of the love's power. The victims first show a manic state where they declare their love for Pepe before devolving into a more silent state where they fight for him while in a daze. Additionally, Meninas is able to use her shrift, the power, whilst under the influence of the love, indicating that victims are not restricted from using their full power while under its control. But what is unclear is if the affected victims are able to fight at the same skill level as before. Returning to the fight between Hisagi and Byakuya, Pepe was rambling on about how the power of his shrift works, while Byakuya had taken the opportunity to incapacitate Hisagi. During this time, Byakuya observed that the love's power would likely stop if the victim was immobilized. This was confirmed by Hisagi's inability to move after being knocked out. Byakuya concludes that killing Pepe would end the power of his love, a statement that Pepe himself verifies as he commends Byakuya's ability to analyze and understand his power in order to come to that conclusion. After they briefly clash, we see Pepe's love projectiles used in an all-new way. He shoots them towards Byakuya, who dodges them, but one of them imprints themselves onto a building behind him. Pepe then manipulates this projectile to extend far past its point of impact, and he makes it chase after Byakuya, who is still able to effortlessly avoid it. Now, after noticing that the building exhibited no supernatural features, Byakuya is able to deduce that the love doesn't work on buildings, which is due to the fact that buildings don't have souls. Now, this statement in itself is an interesting one because previously in the story it was established that everything has a soul. Now this statement was made in chapter 432 during the Fullbring arc, where Ginjo had explained that literally every object has a soul, but Ginjo did elaborate by saying that the soul within inanimate objects was quite small, so it's possible that it was far too small to be influenced by the love, or maybe that Byakuya just failed to consider this fact. Also, Ginjo's example may be in reference to how we imprint ourselves onto inanimate objects that are sentimental to us, like how Ichigo's soul is imprinted onto his substitute Shinigami badge. So what follows this scene supports the idea that it was an oversight on Byakuya's part, since he slashes away the next love projectile with his Zanpakuto as he realizes his mistake a second too late, as his Zanpakuto now turns against him. He flings it away as Pepe explains that he can even steal the hearts of Zanpakuto with his power. Byakuya was unaware that Hisagi had gotten back up and picked up his Zanpakuto that he threw away. He then proceeds to attack Byakuya with Senbon Sakura and Kazeshini. The skillful captain is able to block all attacks with his bare hands. While distracted by Hisagi, Byakuya fails to see an incoming love projectile which hits him in the back. Now surprisingly it has no effect, and this ends up being explained by Kubo in his official fan club Klub Outside. The reason that it didn't work was because of the Oken clothing that Byakuya was wearing. This supports the impressive defensive capabilities of the Oken clothing. Frustrated by how ineffective his love power was, he goes into his holy form and Pepe creates what he calls the love rope. This can be described as a long chain of his heart-shaped constructs, and he stabs Byakuya through the back with it and orders Hisagi to halt his attack, and that he was going to make Byakuya love him no matter what. And yes, I'm just as uncomfortable as you are here, but somehow it gets worse. In what would be his final gross use of his equally gross power, he pulls out a bow and arrow from his mouth, because why not? He then prepares to fire his arrow, but thankfully his face gets kicked in from Kensei. This is one time in the story where I was genuinely happy I didn't get to see a character's ultimate technique, because I just needed him off the screen, but I'd assume that his arrow is most likely a condensed version of his original love projection, which is able to steal anyone's heart without exception. Now, after this attack gets disrupted, we don't really see much of Pepe again, outside of a statement that he makes about his love being stronger than Giselle's zombie Schrift, and how his ability to love doesn't work on Mayuri zombies. When everything's said and done, the love is a power that could have wreaked great havoc during the 1000-year Blood War arc, but that is if Pepe had the common sense to remain hidden. It has none of the weaknesses of Giselle's zombie Schrift, and it's outright stated to be more powerful than it, but Pepe somehow manages to achieve far less than Giselle. In conclusion, the love was a rather powerful Schrift that gladly never reached its full potential, all because once again the goat Mayuri had created an answer for its terrifying power, the ability that Gerard Valkyrie wields via his absurdly broken Schrift, the Miracle. Some fans have even resorted to referring to it as the most nonsensical power within the entire story of Bleach, and to be honest, it feels like a very appropriate name for a power that guarantees that you cannot die, one where you can't really be hurt, and any damage that you do take ends up being converted into more power. The Miracle leaves no room for strategy. It counters almost everything that would matter in a traditional fight. It literally takes the strength of the opponent in order to make Gerard even stronger, and for a long time this power was believed to be the ultimate Quincy power, up there with the likes of the Balance, the Visionary, and the Almighty. Recently, it appears that a new revelation has put the undisputed position of the Miracle into question. This new information has brought some degree of uproar amongst fans, since they had believed that Kubo had made up this answer. This is a very common sentiment that fans hold towards Kubo and the information that he reveals on his official fan club Klub Outside. Now in this video I'm going to be breaking down and analysing everything that we know about the Miracle, what its power entails, how it functions. Klub Outside has become an absolute goldmine for Bleach fans, from little bits of trivia being revealed to small hints about the future of Bleach within certain answers that Kubo gives. Now in one of the recent questions that Kubo had answered about Gerard's Schrift ability, the Miracle, Kubo's answer had sent fans into an uproar. He had revealed that the cross that appears after he was cut by Kinpachi was actually the core of his power, and had it been destroyed, Gerard would have actually died. Now this is a huge reveal which has gotten many fans wondering if Kubo is really just making things up as he is going along, or if this is a plausible weak point that he has introduced into Gerard's
Gerard's character. The more that I think about it, the more that it makes sense. But before going into this in detail, let's start from the beginning. When I'd first seen Gerard Valkyrie and his loud personality, I'd known for a fact that he was going to be one of two things. Either he'd be an absurdly powerful character, or he was just going to be absolute fodder like Yami. Now this is part of what makes me love Kubo so much as a writer. A lot of what he does subverts your expectations. You might predict that the battle is going one way and it ends up going the complete opposite direction. Kubo nails it perfectly with Gerard's introduction, as it's hard to predict what direction this character is going to go in. We see him jumping this incredible distance and landing before the Shinigami in chapter 647, and then he tells them to go ahead and attack them all at once, as we quickly understand that he is going to be an absurdly overpowered character. But then Kubo subverts our expectations by showing him getting absolutely demolished by the Shinigami, with Byakuya even brutally executing him. Now Kubo once again flips the script by revealing that he was neither absurdly powerful or total fodder, but rather both, because it's only after his brutal murder that his true power is revealed. The first time that Gerard uses the miracle, it gives us a number of hints as to how his ability really works. Firstly, there's this speech that he gives to the Shinigami before Byakuya kills him. He explains that the very idea of miracles or miraculous events is often predicated on despair, and that a miracle is only a miracle because there's a hopeless situation involved. A situation as hopeless as being surrounded by enemies who are significantly more powerful than yourself, and it's in these circumstances that miracles occur. So in actuality, this explanation is merely an analogy for how this ability works, instead of implying that he has some conceptual ability to create miracles out of nothing. So after Byakuya kills him, his power takes effect, and he grows in both size and power. At the time, Kubo's explanation of there being a cross that served as the anchor of his being was yet to have been revealed. After Gerard had gained his first power-up, the fight had quickly turned in his favor. He had started to overwhelm the Shinigami, who were still trying to comprehend how he had suddenly grown in size and power. I believe it's necessary to make the distinction that this new power doesn't necessarily make him more powerful than the Shinigami present. Byakuya had only attacked him with the power of his Shikai, and while Byakuya was significantly stronger at the time, it would still make zero sense for it to give him the power to overcome Renji's own Bankai, Rukia's, or even Shinji's deadly hollow powers. But yet Kubo depicts this perfectly, as he shows that Gerard's sudden growth completely had thrown them off, and it was in the midst of the chaos that had resulted in Gerard being able to defeat them. So in this state, it would be wrong to say that Gerard was flatly more powerful than the Shinigami present just because he had defeated them while they were in their lower powered states. You'll understand why I'm making this distinction here later on in the video as I continue to break down the miracle's power. After the revelation of what Gerard's Schrift entails, we also learn that his powers are purely innate, that Yhwach didn't give him or Pranida any powers, but rather their Schrifts were given as validation of the power that they had already possessed. We learned that Pranida and Gerard were born with parts of the Soul King's body, Gerard being the heart of the Soul King and Pranida being his left hand. On just this point alone, there is so much untapped potential that I really hope that the anime capitalizes on. This whole idea of people being born with parts of the Soul King's body needed a bit more context within the manga, so I'm looking forward to some anime exclusive scenes when it gets around to adapting that material in Core 3 and Core 4. Now after Kubo finally remembers that the Vizards still exist within the story, Gerard's dominance would remain uncontested even after Hitsugaya arrives onto the battlefield, with his Bankai having very little effect on the behemoth before him. Byakuya's assistance also added very little to the situation, and the prospects seemed to be hopeless until the Shinigami had a miracle of their own via the arrival of Kinpachi onto the battlefield, as Kinpachi makes an impactful entrance by slashing Gerard's right arm. Gerard instantly regenerates his arm and explains that it's grown even stronger as a result. I interpret the miracle to work by directly converting physical damage into mass and power. This explains why, even after receiving a massive boost from the Shinigami's combined assault and Byakuya's brutal finish, that he was still weak enough to be wounded by the significantly stronger Kinpachi. After Kinpachi's arrival, we learn a new application of the miracle's power, as Gerard starts to take the fight much more seriously and he even unsheaths his sword. He explains that Hoffnung, his sword, is actually an aspect of his miracle ability. This is a one-of-a-kind power within the story. The Quincy obviously manifest multiple spirit weapons in combat as they manipulate reishi into different weaponry, and they have even proven to channel their Schrift powers through the weapons that they create. Now there hasn't been a single instance that we've been introduced to a named weapon that possesses abilities that serve as a completely different aspect of their power, except for Gerard and his sword Hoffnung. It is said that his sword embodies the hopes of the people, and as such any damage that the blade takes is instantly reflected to the people who did the damage. This leads to the strongest person on the Shinigami's team, Kinpachi, collapsing from all of the wounds that he sustains, which were reflected by Jirard's sword. This is a very handy ability for getting around tough opponents. It's unfortunate that this power doesn't get as much of the spotlight as it truly deserves, because in actuality it's a really overpowered ability. This is because not only is he growing stronger and faster with the damage that he takes, but with every sword clash his opponent is also becoming weaker. These two abilities make such a devastating combo that if Jirard had been fast enough to block Bankai Kinpachi's attack, then he would have probably instantly killed Kinpachi due to the damage his sword Hofnung would have reflected back to him. After Kinpachi activates his Bankai, it results in a massive power gap forming between the two of them, and it's Jirard in fact who gets instantly killed by the incredible power of his Bankai. Jirard is split clean in two just from a single slash from Kinpachi's absolutely wild Bankai power. Now it's at this point where we are introduced to the cross and we can understand what Kubo was explaining in his answer on Klub Outside. Kubo says that the cross that had appeared was actually Jirard's core, and similar to Melzagard from One Punch Man, his long line of resurrections and regeneration would have ended if that cross could have been destroyed. He phrases it in such a way that it implies even Kinpachi's Bankai didn't have the power to destroy it, which has me wondering if it has any special defenses of its own that make it so difficult to destroy. But since that wasn't explained or shown within the manga, let's ask another question, which is just how consistent is the explanation that Kubo has given with the story that we have been told within the manga, because that is where we really start to see Kubo's original intentions for Jirard. Despite us never seeing this cross ever again, there are multiple instances within the story that can help us to imply what kind of functions it serves. After the cross makes its appearance and Jirard's body is restored, the Quincy now grows indisputably more powerful than any of the Shinigami present. But all hope is not lost as Hitsugaya accesses the true power of his Bankai. He uses his new ability to not just freeze his opponent, but to also negate any supernatural powers that they have. Now, one thing that used to really bother me about this fight is that Jirard's the miracle power wasn't negated by Hitsugaya's ability, because there's no real reason that it shouldn't have been affected by it, especially when Kubo had shown us that Hitsugaya's power was able to completely destroy Jirard's sword and to negate its power. But things make a bit more sense when you add Kubo's explanation into the mix. The reason that Hitsugaya's ice couldn't negate the miracle was because Jirard's body wasn't where the miracle had come from, nor was its supernatural function tied to it. If the ice was able to reach the cross within Jirard's body, then it would have been able to negate his power. This meant that when Hitsugaya had encased him in Shikai Hyoketsu, he had only negated the supernatural functions within Jirard's body, which was his now absurd strength and durability, so it could successfully create a condition for them to kill Jirard, which also explains why Byakuya's Bankai even had any effect on his frozen body to begin with, because Hitsugaya had negated all of his body's physical enhancements. This also partially explains why a weakened Kinpachi was able to stop Jirard in order to set up this finishing combo. Now, if you want more proof for the existence of this cross construct, then just notice how Jirard had regenerated again into his pure energy form, as we were able to see a very peculiar transformation sequence. As Jirard had started to regenerate, you'd notice that a lot of the reishi that made up his body was all converging towards a particular point, almost the same as when his body was picked back up and pieced together. This has me wondering whether if Kubo had planned for this fight against Jirard to go on longer than it had within the manga, which in a way is really insane to imagine, because it's already quite long. Now, it's going to be interesting to see if Kubo is going to incorporate this information he's revealed on his official fan club into the anime adaptation of the 1000-Year Blood War arc. If there will be any anime exclusive scenes which will reveal a bit more about this cross, which is revealed to be the source of Jirard's power, the Miracle. This Schrift ability, the Miracle, is a power-up that could have honestly done a lot of damage. One of the things that I find most hilarious to imagine was that what if during Squad Zero's battle with the Schutzstaffel, Uetsu Nimaya had decided to block Hofnung instead of dodging it. It's obvious that the tables would have turned in such a spectacular manner. I had so much fun thinking about Jirard's power and how it works, and it's for this reason that I want to hand over the discussion to all of you. What do you think about the Miracle as an absurdly broken ability? I definitely think it's a power that deserves much more love than it had received. Hopefully the anime version of the final arc shines more of a spotlight onto it and reveals a bit more of the quirks behind this incredible power. Let's have a look at one of the more straightforward Schrift abilities, and this is granted to the Sternritter, who only appears during the first Quincy invasion. This is Sternritter O, known as the Overkill
Driscoll Bercy. He explains in chapter 503 that his Schrift ability, the Overkill, allows him to grow stronger with every life that he takes. The more that he kills, the more powerful he becomes, and this applies indiscriminately. His ability doesn't distinguish between friend or foe or even humans and animals because every death adds to his strength. Driscoll boasts about having slain hundreds of Shinigami during the invasion, with each kill further amplifying his power. However, despite his growing strength, his boastful arrogance is short-lived as he's effortlessly destroyed by Yamamoto, who demonstrates just how massive the gap is between the Captain Commander and one of the Sternritter. Another Schrift rooted in raw physical strength is the Power, and this belongs to Sternritter P. Meninas. Within chapter 585, we witness the force of this ability when Meninas lands a single punch against Ichigo. She sends him crashing into rubble in an instant. We also saw this Schrift in action when she joins the coordinated assault by the Bambis against Kenpachi Zaraki, right after his brutal battle against Gremi. Meninas is shown hurling Kenpachi's body through several buildings just by using a single arm, as we see her muscles visibly increase in size. As her title implies, the Power grants her overwhelming brute strength, and in the Can't Fear Unworld light novels, we see her clash with Hikone as she finds herself to be outmatched, but she brings her fist down with full strength as Hikone absorbs the impact of her elbow and falls a few dozen meters. Hikone finds their footing by fixing the reishi beneath their feet, and in the aftermath, despite being the one throwing the punch, Meninas's fist ends up twisted and shattered with several broken fingers. This highlights that brute force isn't always the determining factor in a fight. The Schrift called the Question belongs to Sternritter Q Bernice Gabrielli. Despite Bernice having very limited screen time, he still possesses a very interesting ability. As Kenpachi goes on to explain within chapter 503, the Question is a Schrift that is based upon the philosophical concept of objectivism. Where Bernice speaks, he bombards his opponent with relentless philosophical questions, trying to force them into doubting their own existence. If the opponent fails to answer or mentally resist these questions, they are punished, presumably by undergoing a psychological breakdown or experiencing an existential crisis. While the exact effect of the punishment isn't shown, the Schrift clearly targets the mind and not the body. However, Bernice's ability has two key weaknesses. It doesn't work if he cannot speak, as demonstrated when Kenpachi rips out his throat, and it's ineffective against individuals with impaired hearing. So when all of the right conditions are met, it is devastating, but if the Question is up against someone like Kenpachi, then it is a very fragile ability. The Raw is assigned to Sternritter R. Jerome, and he is another one of the lesser known Sternritter who falls swiftly against Kenpachi. Jerome's Schrift allows him to transform into a large ape-like creature capable of emitting a deafening roar at amplified intensity. The sound waves that are generated by this roar are powerful enough to kill multiple Shinigami in close proximity, but despite its destructiveness, the roar proves to be no match for Kenpachi's sheer battle strength, and Jerome is quickly eliminated by him. Nonetheless, his ability stands out as one of the more primal and monstrous powers amongst the Sternritter, as it embodies chaos and fear through a amplified, deafening roar. I'm of course talking about Mask the Masculine, the luchador who is accompanied by his sidekick James. He is in fact a pro wrestler whose powers grow from the cheers of his fans, or rather his singular fan. In this video, I'm going to be taking it upon myself to analyze and explain every aspect of Mask's Quincy ability called the Superstar. Mask is present during the first invasion, but he doesn't reveal his power, and this isn't because he lacks screen time, but rather because he didn't really need to use it. Mask first appears within chapter 495 during the fight between Asnot and Byakuya. At this time, Renji had just arrived to stop Asnot from killing some Shinigami in the area. Renji had quickly engaged the invader in combat, only to realize that none of his attacks were effective because of a Quincy defensive ability called Blutveen. While Renji was contemplating his next move, a massive figure attacks him from above, and this is none other than Mask the Masculine. Renji had managed to dodge the attack by jumping into the air, but Mask had quickly realigned himself for another strike, leaving Renji open to attack. However, Byakuya Zenbon Sakura had protected Renji by intercepting Mask before he could reach Renji. During the intense battle that had followed, Renji had tried his best to save his captain by activating his own Bankai, but before he could even utter the word Bankai, he was slammed from the side by a dropkick that had sent him flying across the Soul Society. This attack had come from Mask the Masculine, and it's unclear if Mask had used the power of the superstar here to enhance his strength to the point that he could one-shot Renji, or if that was just his regular power. I would love to know what all of you think in terms of Mask's power scaling during this scene, but personally I believe that he was in fact cheered on by James here, and I'll explain why later on in the video. The first proper showcase of the superstar occurs during the second invasion of the Quincy, which begins from chapter 560. Here Mask is seen brutally attacking everyone's favorite punching bag and damage sponge Shuhei Hisagi. After connecting a devastating clothesline on Hisagi, Mask aims a downward stomp towards his head in order to finish him off. Fortunately enough, Kensei had intercepted the attack in one of the most coolest entrances during the story arc. Seeing Hisagi withstand such a beating and still survive supports what is later revealed about him during the Can't For Your Own World light novels. If you want to know more about Hisagi's newfound powers, including his Bankai, then I recommend you check out my standalone video where I discuss all of Hisagi's powers that are revealed from the Can't For Your Own World light novels. At this point in the battle, this is where we begin to see what Mask is capable of. Kensei, who had arrived onto the battlefield with Rose, quickly activates his own Bankai and begins to fight the Sternritter. Mask leads with a powerful dropkick similar to the one that he had used against Renji during the first invasion. This had created a massive shockwave that travels across the Soul Society. However, it does little damage to Kensei, who casually blocks it and responds with a punch from his Tekken Tachikaze, which creates an even bigger shockwave. Kensei explains that his Bankai releases explosions within the bodies of his enemies infinitely, as long as their bodies remain in contact. He then sends Mask flying with another hit, and the two begin to discuss how weak Mask was. Hisagi, who had been lying on the ground, quickly draws their attention to the real threat, which isn't the Sternritter Mask but his sidekick James, who had started to cheer in support for the fallen Mask. Hisagi's observation implies that Mask had already enhanced his power using James's cheers during the fight, so we can logically deduce that Mask's power at its lowest would have struggled against a character of lieutenant class. Now, Hisagi isn't one of the weakest lieutenants, and it's plausible that he and Renji were on the same level before Renji's Royal Guard training. This would mean that when Byakuya had sank Mask down, he was in fact able to receive a power-up from James before he had returned to the surface. Now, this is what I believe had allowed him to take down Renji with that one dropkick. If Mask needed to use James to power up enough to defeat Hisagi, then it stands to reason that Hisagi was overpowering him at some point. Mask has only been shown to resort to using James's cheers when he is backed into a corner by his opponent. Now, returning to the fight, after Hisagi warns the two captains, they don't get a chance to respond as a fully rejuvenated Mask appears behind them and sends Kensei flying into a nearby building with a single swipe of his hand. He then explains that James's cheers are what gives him power. The nature of these power-ups is worth considering, as Mask starts at a level some might consider below lieutenant rank, but after receiving more power from James's cheering, Mask completely surpasses Hisagi's power level. Despite being utterly defeated by Kensei, Mask gets another power-up from James, which somehow elevates him from the level of a lieutenant to a captain rank level. Now, this is a significant power-up. Throughout the story of Bleach, it's made very clear that an inconceivable gap exists between captains and lieutenants of the Gotei 13. So much so that most captains can casually defeat lieutenants without even using their Shikai. Byakuya even states later on, when Hisagi falls under Pepe's control, that a single Kido blast from him would have been sufficient to have killed Hisagi. But with just one cheer from James, Mask crosses and even surpasses that chasm of power, proceeding to effortlessly defeat Captain Kensei. It is nothing short of astonishing to see how Kensei, who had once dominated Mask in their fight, could no longer keep up with his speed or even hurt him with his Bankai. The Sternritter utterly demolishes him with multiple devastating blows, snapping Kensei's arm like a twig and delivering a crushing chop to his head, and lastly finishing him off with a descending knee slam. Then Captain Rose turns up, and I know that I've given this character a hard time in some of my other videos on this channel, so instead of going over what happens to him, let's try a different approach. Rose's actions weren't as thoughtless as they might seem. For instance, Kensei himself explained what his Bankai did when he was pummeling Mask. The need for an explanation had served two purposes. One was so that the audience could understand what was happening, and secondly, because knowing how powerful Kensei's punches were wouldn't have made a difference for Mask, as Kensei was significantly stronger and faster than him at this point. So realistically, the explanation couldn't have caused any real harm. Now, the same
applies for Rose, as he had no idea that Mask had a way to heal himself outside of his power enhancing ability, and he had gone on to explain this technique, not expecting that Mask would go to the extreme of destroying his own eardrums. In Rose's eyes, the battle was already decided. Covering his ears wouldn't have stopped the effects of Kinshara Butodan, so while it's a hilarious moment to poke fun at, the situation isn't as foolish as some portray it to be. Rose genuinely didn't expect that Mask could heal himself or go to such lengths in order to prevent the effects of his technique. The captain really was caught off guard by what he had witnessed, and Rose was then hit by Mask's beam. It may be a little bit unfair because of the amount of criticism that Rose receives for this very moment, but who am I kidding? It was absolutely hilarious to watch unfold. So eventually Renji arrives onto the battlefield and saves Rose's life, and the rest is history. I've discussed this particular battle multiple times before, so instead I'd prefer to analyze how Mask uses the superstar in this fight. When Renji begins to overwhelm and overpower Mask, he relies on James's cheering to enhance his power to what he calls its peak, where he undergoes a wardrobe change with a new mask and costume appearing. And this is all before he activates his holy form. Now this implies that despite the massive power growth that he experiences throughout the fight, there is a limit to the power that he can gain from James's cheering. This leads me to believe that James is a relatively weak character with an incredibly high power ceiling, and this creates an interesting limitation for his power. If he fights someone with murderous intent, he could be killed before he even gets a chance to power up. However, there is a small issue. Now the small issue that I haven't addressed until now refers to James. Both of these beings are aspects of each other, so to successfully defeat Mask and James, it's necessary to kill both of them simultaneously. This is the only way to ensure the defeat of Mask. This means unless James is entirely vaporized, he'll survive any attack, which creates more instances of himself, thus allowing Mask to grow stronger as a result. This highly resilient nature and fluctuation in power is somewhat reminiscent of professional wrestlers, who can switch between being complete pushovers and absolute powerhouses, depending on how they are perceived by the audience. Kubo had taken this concept in its most archetypal form and had made Mask's strength directly dependent upon the cheers of his fans. But as if this power couldn't get any more stronger, it's revealed both within the manga and confirmed on Kubo's official fan club Klub Outside that James is actually the real Sternritter, and Mask Demasculine is his ideal form that he is given shape to. So this ability always comes to mind when I think of how creative Kubo can be with his power-ups, and for good reason. This is a well-designed power that sets up Renji to take center stage for once.
Candice Catnip wields the Schrift letter T for the Thunderbolt. It is a power that allows her to summon and control lightning with deadly precision. Using this power, Candice can call down bolts of lightning from the sky and direct them towards her opponents. She's also capable of generating multiple simultaneous strikes, effectively turning the battlefield into an electrified storm zone, capable of hitting numerous targets at the same time. Nanana Najakoop possesses the Schrift letter U for the Underbelly. This is a unique ability that is rooted in precision and analysis, as he observes a target's Reiatsu over a certain period of time, as Nanana can then accurately analyze how their energy is distributed across their body. Once he has gathered enough data, he marks the target with his Schrift's letter and he overlays a specialized grid across their spiritual energy, as he refers to this configuration as his morphine pattern. This grid enables Nanana to identify and exploit weaknesses which are specific holes or vulnerability points in a target's Reiatsu. By attacking these weak points, he gradually expands them until the target's spiritual energy is completely drained, leading to total incapacitation. This ability was proven to be highly effective within chapter 623, as he uses it against the overwhelmingly powerful Sosuke Aizen, highlighting just how dangerous this Schrift can be when used with strategic intent. But in this video, I want to analyze the insane power of Grammy. It's his overpowered Schrift called the Visionary. In this video, I'll analyze this Schrift in its totality, from its powers to its weaknesses, as well as talking about the role that it plays within the narrative, as well as some theories surrounding just what Grammy's ability can do. When Grammy was first introduced, he didn't seem any different from the average psychotic Sternritter. It is revealed that Grammy had materialized a Sternritter from his imagination. At the time that this was revealed, this level of creative power was completely unprecedented within the world of Bleach. The only people who had even come close to such a feat were individuals like Kiryu Hikifune, who had created the Mod Soul, and Mayuri Kurosuchi, who had created Namu. But even these examples pale in comparison to what Grammy had done
with his power. Unlike Kiryu and Mayuri, who had achieved their feats via high levels of scientific knowledge accumulated over decades of experimentation, Grammy on the other hand had utilized the powers of his Schrift, the Visionary, in order to create an imaginary Sternritter. It was a fully sentient being with its own will and powers, and according to the beginning of the Revive of Tomorrow novel, Lee wasn't the only Sternritter created via Grammy's power. Shaz Domino was also another Sternritter who was actively trying to find a way to free himself from Grammy's control. Each of these characters had possessed their own goals and desires and were in no way subservient to Grammy. It makes you wonder whether if Grammy could have single-handedly created an entire army of Sternritter for Yhwach if he wasn't locked away. We get to see Grammy utilize his ability to create more life later on, but for now let's focus on how he utilizes the Visionary when he first appears. During Lee's battle against Yachuru, which had taken place between chapters 570 to 572, Grammy makes his appearance within the room and immediately kills Lee by imagining him out of existence, erasing him just as easily as he had created him, and showing off just how dangerous his visionary power is. Yachuru and Isane watch on in horror as they realize that their new visitor was sitting right on the unconscious Kensei's bed. Isane immediately orders Grammy to move away from the unconscious captains after realizing how dangerous the Sternritter is, but Grammy mockingly tells her not to worry because he has already killed the captains. I remember how shocked I had felt when I had first read that line, and upon reading it again I find myself still reeling from how impactful this scene was. Grammy had already killed them with his power, and this was immediately confirmed by Isane, who had checked their vitals with her spiritual pressure and had found no readings. Grammy had instantly killed them using his imagination, so it became clear that Grammy could not only create life with his Schrift, but he could also take it away just as easily. He had further showed off his power by transmuting Yachuru's bones into cookies, before explaining that his power had allowed him to bring all that he could imagine into reality. Now, before we analyze his battle against Kinpachi and how he had used the Visionary in that fight, let's quickly go over everything that we know so far. The Visionary had allowed Grammy to create living beings who function no differently than the average soul within Bleach. Now, this means that Grammy's creative abilities have no apparent weaknesses. His creations are different from the Shadow Clones from Naruto or Doflamingo's Black Knights from One Piece. The Sternritter was actually able to create living beings, and in the same vein, Grammy was able to take the life away from his own creations or even others just by imagining them dead. Now, this fantastic introduction that Kubo gives to the Visionary depicts it as a power that can control the very forces of life and death on a whim. Now, this detail becomes more important as the battle between Grammy and Kinpachi begins. Within chapter 572, right before Grammy could kill either Yachuru or Isane, Kinpachi comes onto the scene by smashing through a wall in a manner that only Kinpachi really can do. The fight begins within chapter 573, where Grammy would once again use the Visionary, but this time he uses it to create a massive stage that towers over the Wandenreich city that they are surrounded by. It's interesting to question why the stage didn't simply just appear out of nowhere and had to gradually grow out of the ground, but that's a question that we'll tackle later on during our final analysis of his power. Kinpachi attempts to kill Grammy by cutting him down his shoulder, but he realizes that his blade isn't able to pierce him. The Sternritter explains that he had imagined that his skin is as hard as steel, but in true Kinpachi style, he responds by slashing through his shoulder like it is just regular flesh. This severely wounds Grammy, but with the power of the Visionary, he is able to heal himself. In this instance, Kinpachi proves that there is nothing that he is unable to cut. At the start of their battle, Grammy uses his powers in two different defensive ways, by hardening his skin and then demonstrating that he can also heal himself. Now, before their fight had started on their newly elevated stage, Grammy had prefaced their battle by saying that due to how little respect Kinpachi had for his power, he was going to kill Kinpachi by only using his head. Now, this meant that in this fight, Grammy's goal wasn't to outright kill Kinpachi, but rather to create something with the Visionary that Kinpachi's strength was unable to overcome. Grammy then switches the Visionary into creative mode, as he manifests lava using the Visionary, which comes gushing towards Kinpachi. Now, this has Kinpachi only slightly amused as he casually slashes it away. He then notices that Yachuru was still kneeling in her original position, and she hadn't moved since he had arrived. Now, this is because her bones were transformed into cookies, and she was immobile due to her fear that all her bones would break if she had risked moving. It's after this that we see the Visionary being used even more, as Grammy utilizes it to instantly create a mass of water in order to trap the airborne Kinpachi, who was rapidly descending with a slash. This mass of water was suspended in a cube in mid-air, and aside from this, it was
no different from actual water. He then follows this up by creating a massive gap within the stage that he had created so that Kinpachi would fall right into it. He once again uses the visionary to close the gap that he had created, basically crushing Kinpachi. But unsurprisingly, this doesn't stop the captain as he smashes through the stage and chucks a huge chunk of the stage towards Grammy. The Sternritter uses the visionary to completely erase the rock that is moments away from making impact. Now this is the third time that we see him use his power in a defensive manner. He then sees Kinpachi rapidly descending towards him about to attack, but he defends himself by manifesting a stone pillar. Now it's at this time that we notice that Kinpachi was holding onto Yachiru this entire time, but she seems to be perfectly fine, which indicates one of the visionary's only real weaknesses. Despite possessing practically perfect abilities, the powers of Grammy's influence is limited by his attention span, meaning that the average Gen Zer would be even worse at using the visionary than even Grammy. Now that's something to think about. This is honestly a pretty creative and reasonable weakness to introduce into Grammy's ability, which is powered by his brain, and I don't think Kubo gets enough credit for this. After the revelation of the visionary's weakness, the battle would go into full swing as Grammy uses it for multiple different purposes, from manipulating multiple parts of his stage to attack Kinpachi, or to manifesting a myriad of firearms, and even creating literal missiles that he launches towards Kinpachi, all of which prove to have little to no effect upon the captain. Now there's a key detail that I want to touch upon before rounding up on all of the feats that Grammy accomplishes with the visionary. It's the fact that Kinpachi was able to successfully land several blows upon the Sternritter. You might have been wondering why I haven't included this particular occurrence as one of the visionary's weaknesses. This is mainly because I don't believe that this is an actual weakness of the ability, but rather a byproduct of Grammy's lack of combat experience. During the fight, Grammy finds himself on the receiving end of multiple slashes from Kinpachi. He was receiving the wounds quicker than he could even react to them or heal them. There was even a point within the battle that Grammy had accepted that his defeat was inevitable. He had started to even imagine himself being defeated. This was brought to his attention by Kinpachi, who had noticed that he had stopped fighting back. After drawing his attention to this fact, Grammy had realized that he was in the middle of imagining his own defeat and had inadvertently started manifesting it with the visionary. After quickly catching himself, he had erased any possibility of his own death from his mind, granting himself some sort of a pseudo-immortality. I personally don't believe that this is an actual weakness of the visionary, since a more experienced user would know not to imagine their own defeat. It's rather a weakness born from Grammy's inexperienced mind, rather than the ability itself. Now we've come to the point that I consider the most interesting part of this video, and this is the part of Grammy's power that had sparked the most fan debate. And it all begins when Grammy had used the visionary to create what resembles a replica of himself, but he explains that it's neither a clone or an illusion, but rather a completely new instance of himself. And by doing so, the power of his imagination had in fact doubled. The meaning of this doubled power is a rather contentious subject, but to truly understand what this doubling meant, we'll have to look back on every time that the visionary was used before this. Throughout his battle against Kinpachi, the visionary's power was almost perfect, with its one glaring weakness being that the longevity of its influence was only limited by the attention span of its user. This meant that Grammy would have struggled to create something that had required an insane level of detail to maintain. So by creating a new instance of himself, he had actually doubled his attention span, along with doubling the power of his imagination. This is further supported by his statement about how the meteor that he had just manifested would still exist even if Kinpachi was able to kill him before it lands. Unlike before, where merely shifting his attention would be enough to undo the direct effects of the visionary. This means that he no longer needs to consciously focus his attention on a target in order to maintain the effects of the visionary. Another way that creating another instance of himself would have helped was most likely with his ability to create much larger scaled and more complex things, like his galaxy room, since he now had multiple minds to manage the extreme detail needed to manifest something of that scale. Now let's go over the final few times that Grammy had used the visionary during his battle against Kinpachi. The Sternritter was able to share his immortality and invulnerability with his clones that he had created, making it so neither of them could be harmed by Kinpachi. After the captain destroys the Sternritter's meteor by using Nozarashi, Grammy creates 3 additional versions of himself and performs what is indisputably his greatest feat. He creates a galaxy and traps Kinpachi within it. Believing that he has sealed him away to die a slow death within the cold void of space, Kinpachi reappears, piercing through the very fabric of space and cutting right right through Gremmy, who had stopped hardening his skin at this point. The Sternritter then turns all of his clones into explosives and detonates them, which heavily wounds Kinpachi. He then tries to give himself all of Kinpachi's power and destroys his body in the process, eventually ending the Sternritter's life. Now, after going over how the Visionary was used, we can conclude that Gremmy uses it to manifest a variety of abilities, things like creation, matter manipulation, power mimicry, and numerous other feats. The Visionary had succeeded in perfectly manifesting several feats, so perfectly that there is a lot of fan debate on what the exact rules of the Visionary are. Earlier on in the video, we had established the one weakness of the Visionary, but that aside, the Visionary exists specifically in a universe with a set of rules that govern how certain powers should interact. And after considering how unlimited Gremmy's power had appeared to be, fans had argued whether if Gremmy's power obeyed the spiritual pressure laws that the other fights of Bleach follow. I think that the answer to this question is much simpler than we realize. I believe that while the powers and capabilities of the Visionary are essentially unlimited, they still in fact obey Reiatsu law, and as a result use Reiatsu as its main fuel, since Quincy specialized in absorbing and manipulating Reiatsu. Now this is proven by a statement made by one of the Shinigami at the end of Gremmy's battle against Kinpachi. One of the unseated Shinigami noted that the vibrating spiritual pressure had stopped immediately after Gremmy had died. This indicates that Gremmy was using spiritual pressure as a fuel for the Visionary, which means that his powers are also limited by the laws that govern Reiatsu. I believe that the power that Gremmy's brain is able to manifest is probably even higher than Kinpachi's maximum Reiatsu. This is firstly because his imagination was perfectly capable of simulating and granting himself Kinpachi's power. If Kinpachi's power was beyond the reach of Gremmy's spiritual pressure, then he wouldn't have been able to materialize it in the first place. Now the reason that Gremmy had died from it was because he had failed to realize the fact that the body he was currently using was unable to contain Kinpachi's maximum Reiatsu. The upper limits of Gremmy's ability the Visionary are revealed within the Can't For Your Own World light novels. The only thing that could have withstood the chaotic Reiatsu within Hikone's body was Gremmy's brain. For context, Hikone was a being who, if given enough time, would have evolved to rival the power of the Soul King in his prime, and Gremmy's brain was perfectly capable of handling such a being's power. So it becomes clear that what really had made the Visionary's power so insane was Gremmy's brain and not the Schrift itself, which makes it even more tragic knowing that Gremmy hadn't used the Visionary to its fullest potential. So in the end, what did you think about the fascinating Sternritter Gremmy, and how Yhwach had bestowed upon him an ability that had perfectly complemented his brain?
Sternritter W. Neanzol Weasel possesses the Schrift known as the Wind. This power allows him to deflect attacks aimed directly at him by altering their trajectory as they approach his body. For instance, during his confrontation with the Royal Guards, their sword strikes were visibly redirected, swerving away from his body before they could even land. This defensive capability gives the illusion that all attacks are sliding off of him or miss him entirely. In addition to deflecting attacks, Neanzol can manipulate the physical positions of others by bending their bodies using his Schrift, making him a very dangerous opponent to be up against in close quarters combat.
Lil Barrow's Schrift ability called the X-Axis. In this video, I plan on analyzing every instance that the X-Axis is utilized within the anime and the manga, breaking down everything from its debut appearance when it had tore through the ranks of the Zero Division, all the way up until how he uses this power against Shunsui. Reflecting on Lil Barrow's role during the 1000-Year Blood War arc is not just his powers that are the only aspects of his being that are shrouded in mystery, but his character is pretty mysterious in itself. I mean, outside of Hashward, the other Sternritter are not that extensively explored in the story. Kubo does try to do some damage control with the Sternritter by giving them entertaining personalities and by dumping some interesting lore about some of them, for example with Pernida, whose existence gives readers insight into how the Soul King's mind may have worked and how each separate aspect of the Soul King's being processes what was done to him differently. Contrastingly, you have Askin, who isn't very deeply explored, but on the other hand has a very fun personality which appears to be enough to secure his popularity amongst fans. In terms of Lil Barrow, he is a complete enigma. This is unfortunate because he's easily one of the coolest designed characters in the story. His personality revolves almost exclusively around his unwavering devotion to Yhwach. Kubo portrays this single-minded allegiance impressively, but it also feels like a missed opportunity to delve deeper into Lil Barrow's
Barrow's character. Now, turning our attention towards his abilities, Lil Barrow's powers reflect this very same dedication on a thematic level. So in order to understand the X-axis, let's look through every instance that is used throughout the story, as we unravel the full extent of the X-axis and the implications for this formidable ability. The X-axis first appears within chapter 604 of the manga. Its debut appearance marks a turning point in the battle between Squad Zero and the Schutzstaffel. After Yhwach uses the Ashwaulan to resurrect the fallen Schutzstaffel members, they proceed to prove to Squad Zero why they are the final bosses of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, as we see Uetsu Nimaya standing there with 2 holes in his shoulder. These injuries were sustained after Nimaya had literally single-handedly defeated all of the Schutzstaffel. Lil Barrow's X-axis Schrift ability was enough to leave me jaw-dropped. Nimaya assumes that the reason why Lil's attack was able to hurt him is because he has become stronger after being revived. But this is where Lil corrects him and gives us our first insight into the powers of the X-axis, as he explains that while the Ashwaulan has made him exponentially stronger, the holes in his body were not as a result of this, but rather they were the result of an ability that he already possessed that he didn't have the opportunity to use earlier. He adds that Nimaya's body was not pierced by a bullet, as he fires another shot towards the creator of the Zanpakuto, as the attack appears to have been blocked by both Kurinji and Kiryu, but we then get the devastating reveal that the Quincy's attack had penetrated both of their Zanpakuto and made perfect contact with Nimaya, forming a fatal hole within his chest. I want to really emphasize this detail. The attack from the X-axis pierced through the Zanpakuto of 2 Squad Zero members, something which should be an impossible feat for most of the characters within Bleach. Because if you recall, the toughness of a Zanpakuto blade is determined by the spiritual pressure of the user. So in order to pull this feat off, Lil Barrow would have needed to possess an insane level of Reiatsu in comparison to the Zero Division members. It would be ridiculous to assume that Lil Barrow possesses more spiritual pressure than the Zero Division members. So for this reason, his Schrift ability, the X-axis, must be the reason why he was able to break through their Zanpakuto. Lil explains that the X-axis enables him to uniformly pierce whatever exists between himself and his gun. This means that whatever he aims at is instantaneously pierced by the power of the X-axis. His attacks have no regard for mass, density, distance, and definitely not reishi, meaning that his Schrift ability will pierce anyone and anything within Bleach regardless of any power difference that exists between them. The X-axis is so unbelievably broken that it is, in my opinion, the single most powerful offensive ability in Bleach. And yes, I'm even saying that it supersedes Ichigo's Mugetsu. There is simply no way to outmaneuver the incredibly destructive power of this Schrift ability, and we can deduce all of this just from the first time that it is shown to us, as it's used to literally kill the creator of the Zanpakuto. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this Schrift ability, because as the story continues, we get much more of a deeper look into this power, and honestly, things just get even more terrifying from here. In chapter 645, Lil Barrow decides to play sniper as he starts to take out the Shinigami one after another as they approach Yhwach's tower. This scene perfectly encapsulates the terror of the X-axis. The ease with which Lil dispatches his opponents is almost surreal, as it highlights his exceptional skill as a marksman, which combined with the X-axis creates an unstoppable force. Fascinatingly, we learn that these shots weren't even the full extent of the X-axis's capabilities. For instance, within the Can't For Your Own World light novels, we find out that the attack that he hit Hisagi with was able to penetrate through his Chain of Fate. This illustrates why the X-axis is so terrifying in the hands of Lil Barrow. During Shunsui's battle against Lil, we learn some very cool details about how Lil Barrow is able to fight. Apparently, the Quincy fights under a self-imposed limitation because he believes that if he used the full power of the X-axis while fighting, it would be too unfair for the sinners that he is battling against. The statements that Lil made earlier in his battle against the Zero Division actually supports this, as Lil asserts that no opponent has ever been a challenge against his power. While this is a really nice nudge to the greatness of Shunsui, it does at the same time make the Zero Division look comparatively worse, because after all, they are supposed to be the most elite members of the Shinigami. The limitation that Lil places upon his power is associated with his eye, which is noticeably closed from the time that he's introduced. He reveals that it is the open opening of this eye that unlocks the true potential of the X-axis. We're already familiar with one aspect of this Schrift ability. It is able to execute unblockable and unavoidable attacks that are able to pierce through his targets via his Reishi gun. However, the scope of this power extends far beyond this. When pushed into a tight spot by Shunsui, Lil discloses the full power of the X-axis, which remarkably enhances both his offensive and defensive capabilities. This power allows his attacks to pass through anything, while any attacks that are directed towards Lil end up passing through him too. This revelation is truly staggering, as the sheer power of the X-axis theoretically enables Lil to defeat nearly any character within the story. The possibilities are endless. Imagine if Lil with a single shot is able to destroy the Hokyoku, or even defeat a character as formidable as Aizen before he was transformed into an immortal being. Now, don't be surprised when I say that there is even more to explore when it comes to the powers of the X-axis. Lil explains his methodology of using his power, stating that he deems it to be unfair to use the full extent of his power within a single fight, but if he is pushed beyond a threshold of having used the X-axis 3 times within a single fight, only then does he justify it okay to use the full power of the X-axis. Now, this self-imposed rule doesn't stem from the inherent nature of his abilities, but rather from a personal code of combat that he adheres to. Now, this is really impressive when you consider the fact that he was fighting a character like Shunsui, and had still thought that it was okay to hold back against him just to have a fair fight. In addition to this piece of information, we learned that Lil Barrow was the first Quincy to be granted a Schrift power by Yhwach, and it's for this reason that Lil believes himself to be Yhwach's absolute masterpiece, as he states that he represents Yhwach's honor while he is fighting. In order to uphold Yhwach's image of invincibility, Lil Barrow never truly exerts himself in a battle. This is something that sets him apart from the other Sternritter. Lil Barrow's commitment to Yhwach is all that we really learn about his character, but I believe that there is so much more to him. I just wish that we had a chance to see this within the manga. Once Lil Barrow is up against an enemy who is strong enough to deserve the full might of his X-axis, only then does he allow himself to go all out in order to utterly eradicate his opponent, so that there are no witnesses to a power that is equal in strength to Yhwach's. So for this reason, Lil Barrow is either going to instantly kill you in his base form, or he's going to completely destroy you with the full power of the X-axis. This aspect of his personality suggests that there's more depth to Lil Barrow than meets the eye, and I'm convinced that Kubo wanted to do so much more with his character. Hopefully he has the opportunity to showcase more about him during Core 3 and Core 4 of the anime. The X-axis evolves into nightmarish territory when Lil Barrow activates his holy form, as the Sternritter's power escalates to an almost unimaginable level, transforming him into a literal angel. And that's saying a lot, because a lot of the other holy forms give their users angel wings and halos, but Lil's holy form takes it a step above this, because from what is known about angelology, the angels with the highest wing count have 6 wings, but Lil Barrow in his holy form has 8 wings, which visually represents his extraordinary power. In his holy form, he retains his absolutely broken, all-penetrating offensive power, as well as his intangibility, which gives him incredible defenses. But in addition to this, he gains new abilities. One new power is aura immobilization, where enemies within a certain range of the activation of his holy form lose their ability to move, thus allowing the Sternritter to score a quick kill. Lil Barrow is the type of character who's all about ending the fight as soon as possible, in order to maintain the honor of Yhwach. He also gains an ability to teleport and manipulate light itself. You'll also notice that the holes in his wings are where his X-axis shots are fired from, further amplifying his angelic appearance. When Shunsui assumes Lil's defense was limited to physical attacks, he decides to use Hado number 78. Now, it works just about as well as you'd expect. As we move on to the next phase of Lil Barrow's battle against Shunsui, we begin to learn about some implied limits to Lil Barrow's untouchable defense. With Shunsui now being the one who's pushed into our corner, he activates his Bankai, which is where we begin to see that while there aren't really any conventional means of attacking Lil, there are means of getting around his intangibility. Shunsui's Bankai reveals that Lil Barrow's weakness may come from attacks that rewrite the laws of reality in a specific way. Attacks like Shunsui's Bankai, which turns the world into a stage of sorts where each individual act inflicts a different kind of damage onto his opponent. His Bankai completely circumvents Lil Barrow's intangibility as it allows him to land a fatal blow. Now this is where things get even crazier, because while Shunsui lands this critical attack, Lil Barrow still doesn't end up dying. The Sternritter ends up resurrecting himself, revealing yet another facet of the X-axis, as it bestows not only unmatched offensive and defensive capabilities, but it also grants Lil Barrow a form of immortality. As a divine servant, a holy angel to Yhwach, he seemingly cannot be vanquished. His loyalty to Yhwach goes beyond mere allegiance. It's as if he personifies this devotion, a quality which is unmatched by any of the other Sternritter. It's levels of loyalty that rival the bond between Tozen and Aizen. Following his resurrection, Lil Barrow undergoes a transformation as he emerges in a bird-like form with enhanced abilities. His light manipulation abilities soar to new heights, to the point that he can create massive constructs out of light, and he's able to create extremely destructive blasts with those very lights. This enhancement significantly amplifies both his attack range and potency. Furthermore, he gains the grotesque yet formidable ability to morph his body parts, enabling him to, for instance, enlarge his head for a better view of the battlefield, something that he would do to find his opponents if they are hiding from him. Now, with this new form, it appears as though he has lost his ability to teleport. Considering the tactical advantage that this power would have offered to him during his fight with Shunsui, I don't see why he wouldn't have used it, because at this point in the battle, he isn't really going to be holding anything back. So if he was able to teleport, then I think that he would have. Now, with the Issei family Divine 8 Mirror Sword, it presents a interesting plot twist within the story, which may reveal a vulnerability to the X-axis, but I doubt that this can be considered a weakness with just the X-axis, because the Divine 8 Mirror Sword has a unique ability to mirror and counteract an opponent's strength with an equal amount of force. This means that its effectiveness is tailor-made for combating opponents who wield insane amounts of power. If the Shinken Hakyoken had been used against any of the other members of the Schutzstaffel, then the outcome wouldn't have been any different. Its inherent ability to reflect the strength of powerful opponents suggests that its success against the X-axis isn't a particular weakness of Lil Barrow's ability. So the final aspect of the X-axis that is worth talking about is how it operates following the death of Lil Barrow after he is defeated by the Divine 8 Mirror Sword. So we see him break apart and turn into multiple gigantic bird-like creatures that attack the Soul Society. He states that he's lost his halo, so he has effectively become maybe a fallen angel now. It's confusing as to whether if this new transformation was as a result of the Divine 8 Mirror Sword, or if this was an aspect of his X-axis ability. The more that you think about it, the more questions begin to arise. Would Lil Barrow have been able to return to his base form in this state, or was he stuck in this form because of his destroyed halo? Which part of the X-axis allows him to create clones of himself if he gets killed in his second form? Why is it that he gains new forms after he dies? Would he have been able to achieve these new forms if he wasn't killed by the Divine 8 Mirror Sword? The X-axis, initially a straightforward ability, rapidly unravels into a very mysterious power. Among all of the powers within Bleach, the X-axis stands out as one that is desperately in need for more expansion and clarification as to how it functions. The Schrift letter Y D Yourself is a rare case within the Sternritter, as it is shared between two brothers, Royd Lloyd and Lloyd Lloyd. Within chapter 510, a flashback reveals the origins of their powers and their uncanny resemblance. From as early as the womb, the twins had been unconsciously mimicking each other's appearance. By the time that they reached the age of 12, they discovered that their powers extended beyond each other and they could be used to imitate others also. While their abilities are similar in their function, they are uniquely specialized to each of the twins. Lloyd Lloyd is able to replicate the external appearance, power and combat skills of another person with near perfection, and on the other hand, Royd Lloyd can go even further by copying not just someone's physical form, but also their memories and personality, as he effectively becomes a psychological replica. The difference between how the twins use this ability is the basis of their shared Schrift the Yourself. According to question 549 asked to Kubo on his official fan club, both brothers are apparently capable of mimicking another individual's powers and memories through their Schrift. However, Lloyd's imitation comes with a limit, as he can only retain about 70 to 80% of the target's memories, but despite this, the twins are still terrifyingly effective at at deception, infiltration, and strategic manipulation in battle.
Zombies and Bleach. Never did I think I would say these two words within the same sentence, but to be honest, nothing surprises me when it comes to the 1000-Year Blood War arc. I couldn't have been more grateful for Kubo having introduced zombies into the Bleach universe. The individual who makes this all possible is a Sternritter called Giselle Guel, or in other words, Sternritter Z for the zombie. She possesses a very interesting and deadly, no pun intended, power that in all honesty could have turned the tide of the war towards the Quincy's favour if proper care wasn't taken. Giselle's power was very threatening, and in this video we'll be delving into the very nature of her ability, the rules that it functions by, and how it was implemented within the 1000-Year Blood War arc, as well as speculating on just how her ability works. The first actual time that we see Giselle's zombification power in effect is within chapter 580, after Kinpachi Zaraki defeats Gremi, and he is assaulted by the Bambis, who just so happen to be Candice, Meninas, Lil Toto, and Giselle. They pretty much gang up on Kinpachi in order to kill him while he is in a weakened state. The reason for doing so was to eliminate one of the biggest threats on the battlefield, and it's when they gang up on Kinpachi where we get to see all of the Bambi's abilities being showcased. They all use their respective Schrifts to either attack Kinpachi like Candice and Meninas did, or use them to prevent other Shinigami from coming to Kinpachi's rescue like Lil Toto and Giselle had done. And this in fact is the first time when we see Giselle's zombie Schrift in action. She intentionally draws the attention of a group of unseated Shinigami through the use of reverse psychology, as she tells them to leave her and to go help Kinpachi, as nothing good would come from killing her. They in response decide to kill her before going on to rescue Kinpachi, believing that she'd try to kill them with whatever mysterious power that she possesses. They were unaware that by deciding to kill her, they had inadvertently sealed their own fate. One of the Shinigami had slashed her, wounding her in a manner that would be fatal to most other characters within Bleach. But surprisingly, she remains standing and even mockingly addresses the fact that some of the massive amounts of blood splurting out of her wounds had splashed onto some of the Shinigami. Now it's here when they notice that they cannot feel their limbs, and their skin begins to darken. In an overly excited manner, Giselle explains that whoever is covered in her blood essentially becomes her puppet, after which she forcibly controls the Shinigami into slitting their own throats. This is the first time that we see this power in action, and we can deduce that it's an ability that uses Giselle's blood to completely take over an opponent's body. This turns them into zombies that she has absolute control over. Now at face value, it seems to have similar effects to other controlling abilities like Zomari's Amour, which we see in chapter 300, with the main difference being Zomari's Amour only takes full control of the body if his markings hit the head of his target, while the zombie on the other hand takes full control of the target if her blood makes contact with her opponent's skin. While it's yet to be proven whether if her blood just touching her target's clothing is enough for her ability to take effect, because unlike Zomari's Amour ability, which functions in a very straightforward manner, it seems that there are variations of Giselle's zombie Schrift ability that we see later on within the manga. The next time that we see the zombie being showcased is within chapter 588, where Ikkaku and Yumichika have cornered Giselle and they're considering to attack her. She tries to goad them into slashing her, but Yumichika realizes that it's very likely that they were being baited into a trap, as he also warns Ikkaku about her true motives. He even accurately guesses that coming into contact with her blood is the real danger of facing off against her. Giselle realizes that her attempt at baiting them has failed, and she summons to her aid one of her new zombies. Now this is revealed to be none other than her fellow Sternritter and former friend, if you can kind of class her as that, Bambietta Bastarbine, who has just been defeated by Seijin Komamura. She then reveals that in order to turn Bambi into one of her zombies, she had to kill her herself before being able to turn her. Now this new information about the ability raises a couple of questions. I've always wondered if this restriction exists due to an order from Yhwach, since it might have been wrong for her to enslave her living comrades, and that she was only given permission to control the Sternritters who have already died as a way of maintaining their military power despite deaths having occurred. Now another theory that I have is in relation to how Yhwach absorbs all of the powers and knowledge of any Quincy and Shinigami who die in the battlefield. Maybe Yhwach had wanted to take back the fragment of the soul that he had given to the Quincy before allowing Giselle to turn Quincy into zombies. Maybe Yhwach had placed this restriction upon her power, and this is why it works a certain way only on Quincy and it's different on other individuals. It is pretty fun to speculate all of this, so let me know what you think is the correct answer within the comments about how her zombification ability works and how it differs between Quincy and other beings. Now this is also where we notice that her zombies are no different from conventional zombies, as Bambietta is far less intelligent and she has slurred speech which is considerably slower than when she was alive. This massive decline in physical and mental performance is outright stated in the Can't Fear Unwell light novels, and it's most definitely the reason why Ikkaku and Yumichika had done so well against the Sternritter. I mean, as great as these two characters are, I just don't see them performing that well at all against a full-powered Bambietta. Now, both of them very quickly figure out how her ability to explode works, and they use a combination of Kido and Ikkaku skills in order to successfully cut her down. But this is where Giselle reveals another aspect of her zombie power, stating that her zombies can't really be killed as they've already died, meaning that slashing and stabbing attacks will have little to no effect on them. Ikkaku and Yumichika realize that they had left themselves open for attack, resulting in them being hit by Bambi's bombs and getting heavily wounded. Giselle walks towards them and explains that her power only works on dead Quincy, but this restriction does not apply for Shinigami, as she is able to control them while they are still alive. Now, this explanation is perfectly consistent with what we have seen in her initial showcase of her power against the Shinigami that she had battled within chapter 580. She then bites off a nail and begins to bleed very heavily from her finger, and before any of us have an opportunity to ask just how her fingers can bleed like that, Mayuri arrives onto the battlefield just in time to save them. Now, before going into Mayuri's battle against Giselle, we should first go over everything that we have learned during this encounter, and it's worth noting that by comparing the info that we gain from these first two encounters, we can determine a couple of similarities and differences with how her powers are used, as well as making a few other deductions. The first thing to note is that in both cases of her power being utilized, we notice her victims have a considerably lower intellect and physical mobility. They also seem to lose their personalities as they become completely subservient to her will. They also seem to retain full access to their powers in the state and can access them accordingly, as was shown with Bambietta's bombs and her holy form. But what's most interesting is how this ability doesn't completely rob its victims of their sentience. As we see, Bambietta possesses some remnants of her personality, although it's heavily watered down, and it's solely dedicated to serving Giselle. We see this as the fight continues, and before we finally get a proper explanation of how this ability really works, Mayuri appears, and if you didn't know, during the second half of the 1000 Year Blood War arc, he is pretty much the undisputed MVP. He kicks off his role within the story by saving the wounded Ikkaku and Yumichika, and he banters a little bit with Giselle before a zombified Bambi steps up to protect her. She then begins to ask for Giselle's special something, and if you know, you know, but the zombified Bambi ends up being punched by her as Giselle promises her that she'll get a prize after the fight. I'm pretty certain that Kubo wanted us to think of this scene in a very explicit manner, but this scene actually does end up being relevant to learning a bit more about her zombification power, as we later come to learn that it was Giselle's blood that she had needed and not the other thing. This is also followed up later on in chapter 603, where it seems that when she reclaims her blood from her zombies, she can also heal herself, although this act appears to deactivate her zombie as they require her blood to remain alive. So yeah, just to clarify, it was Bambietta wanting her blood, not anything else, regardless of whatever Yumichika may try to convince you of. Getting back to the fight, Mayuri uses his Reishi locking devices to delay the detonation of Bambi's bombs, causing them to go off right in Giselle and Bambi's faces. Giselle is actually fine since she used Bambi as a meat shield, but Bambi is severely wounded and is even knocked unconscious. Now, this implies that while stabbing and slashing attacks are ineffective, enough concussive force can actually incapacitate her zombies. Realizing that she has lost her most powerful weapon, Giselle summons even more zombies to come fight Mayuri. The number of zombies that are in her control shocks Ikkaku and Yumichika, with them even mentioning how many familiar faces that they can recognize among the zombies. Mayuri responds by summoning his own squad of zombies to fight for him, revealing the reanimated Pre-Verone Espada and Frachione, who unlike Giselle's zombies possess their full personalities and intellects, while also being able to fight just as well as they had done while they were still alive. Now, with this factored in, it becomes rather clear that Giselle was at a massive disadvantage, as Mayuri's zombies would easily tear through her army of zombie Shinigami. We learn another key detail on how her zombification power works during this moment, as Dodoni, while killing the zombie Shinigami, tries his hardest to avoid being splashed by their blood in an attempt to avoid becoming one of Giselle's zombies. Lupi reassures him that it's very likely that the blood of her zombies doesn't spread the zombification ability, because Ikkaku had been splashed by Bambi's blood earlier in the fight and he is still normal. Now, this means that it's only Giselle's blood that can spread the zombification, making her means of spreading it much less convenient than it might be for other control type powers that individuals like Zomari and Pernida possess. Now, this means that the main challenge that she has in a fight is getting her blood onto her opponents. This is why she taunts her opponents into attacking her, which as we have seen she is pretty successful in doing. This means that she's figured out how to deal with the downsides that come with her zombie ability. She's been able to work past those weaknesses in order to reach her desired means, which is pretty impressive if you ask me. In chapter 592 we learn the final piece of information about her zombification ability. After her army of zombies and Bambi get easily defeated by the reanimated Arrancar, she actually reveals her trump card, and to everyone's surprise it's the now zombified Hitsugaya. This reveal makes Mairi realize that they are in serious danger as he orders his Arrancar army to retreat, as Hitsugaya joins the fight and turns the tide of the battle in favor of the Quincy, as he easily defeats the Arrancar Charlotte as well as both Ikkaku and Yumichika, which leads to Mairi himself stepping in to prevent Hitsugaya from killing Ikkaku and Yumichika. Mairi is able to deduce that Hitsugaya is moving just as well as he did while he was alive, but it's evident that he doesn't retain any of his personality or his sense of individuality. Giselle agrees with this assessment and explains that when she zombifies her targets, before they die they retain their physical mobility in exchange for their free will, which results in the creation of the perfect puppet, one that fights as though they are still alive while also being under her control. Now this was a very interesting implication, as it seems that the zombification ability is best suited for fighting Shinigami, and it only comes with multiple downsides when it's used on Quincy. And it's details like this that really make me wonder if Yhwach can actually influence the powers that the Quincy inherit when he gives them their Schrifts, since this addition to restrict the zombification ability on Quincy alone feels very intentional. Now as the battle continues, Mairi succeeds in defeating the zombie Hitsugaya, and Giselle summons more of her zombies, revealing Rose, Kensei and Rangiku, who have also fallen victim to her power. Mairi uses the same drug that he had used to defeat Hitsugaya to take them out, and this is where he deduces that Giselle's power requires her blood reaching her target's brain in order to take full effect, and it's the strength of the individual that determines how much blood Giselle needs to use in order to control them. And this explains why Hitsugaya, Rose, Kensei and Rangiku all had a very dark red hue to their skin. Mairi finds a way to reverse this process by using the zombie's own untainted blood to simulate the same effect, as he essentially turns Giselle's zombies into his own. She ends up being defeated, and it's worth noting that we never really got to see Giselle's holy form in action, since we know that a Quincy's holy form elevates the powers of a Quincy Schrift, and I have no doubt that Giselle's powers would have been further amplified. Now while it's worth noting that she does appear within the Can't For Your Own World light novels, it doesn't really add anything new to all of the information that we have covered within this video. In conclusion, it was thanks to Mairi's resourcefulness and Yhwach's betrayal that the zombification ability doesn't devastate the Shinigami nowhere near as much as it should have. With Giselle still being alive, it'll be very interesting to see what her role will play in the future of Bleach's story.
So this is pretty much every single Schrift ability explained, aside from the two Schrift abilities that we do not know, which is the letter K belonging to Sternritter BG9 and the letter N belonging to Robert Accutrone. There have been several theories as to what these Schrift abilities could be, but unfortunately we have no concrete information, as this wasn't even revealed during anime exclusive scenes in the 1000 Year Blood War arc anime, so these Schrift letters K and N will remain unknown for the time being, unless somebody asks Kubo on his official fan club. The 1000 Year Blood War arc anime has done an incredible job of reintroducing Yhwach and the Sternritter, and hopefully this video has helped you to appreciate each of these Sternritter's powers and specific abilities. We have now reached the point of the video where I do want to hand over the discussion to all of you. What do you think about each of these Sternritter's unique powers and abilities? Which Schrift ability is your favorite? I'd love to know, so definitely continue the discussion in the comments. And lastly, thank you for making it to the end of this video, and I cannot wait to see you in my next Bleach video. A massive thank you goes out to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for helping to make this video possible. If you also want to support the channel and see your name in the end of my videos, then check out my Patreon, which has loads of perks like early video access and so much more. Thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.